There's a place on this earth so remote, so impossibly far from any other inhabited land, that the first humans to reach it must have believed they had sailed to the very edge of the world. It sits alone in the vast, empty expanse of the southeastern Pacific Ocean, a tiny volcanic triangle of rock and grass, barely 63 square miles in total area, surrounded by thousands upon thousands of miles of open water in every direction. On a clear day, you can stand on its highest point and turn a full circle, scanning the horizon, and you will see nothing. Nothing but the endless blue of the sea meeting the endless blue of the sky. No neighboring island, no distant coastline, no passing ship, nothing. And yet on this speck of land, this improbable, wind-battered, isolated fragment of earth, a civilization rose. And that civilization did something that has baffled, astonished, and humbled every outsider who has ever laid eyes upon it. They carved giants out of the mountain. They carved nearly 1,000 of them. And then somehow, impossibly, they moved those giants, some weighing as much as 82 tons, standing as tall as 33 feet miles across the island, erected them upon massive stone platforms and set them to stare forever inland, their enormous stone faces gazing across the land as if guarding something, watching something, waiting for something. They are the Moai of Rapa Nui, and their story is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire history of human civilization. This is Easter Island, and what happened here, what was built here, what was achieved here, and what ultimately collapsed here, is a mystery that we are only now, after centuries of speculation and decades of painstaking scientific research, beginning to truly understand. The island itself goes by many names. The indigenous Polynesian people who carved the statues and who still live on the island today call it Rapa Nui, a name that may translate loosely as Great Rapa or Big Rock, though the precise etymology remains debated among linguists. It has also been called Tipito o Tihenwa, the navel of the world, a name that speaks to the profound isolation its inhabitants must have felt, believing themselves to be at the very center of all existence, surrounded by an infinite ocean with no knowledge of any other land or any other people beyond the horizon. To them, this small island was the world. Everything that mattered, everything that existed, was right here. The name by which most of the world knows it, Easter Island, was given by a Dutch navigator named Jacob Roggeveen, who arrived on the island's shores on Easter Sunday in the year 1722. That date, April 5th, 1722, marks the first recorded contact between the people of Rapa Nui and the outside world. And when Roggeveen and his crew stepped ashore and saw what was there, the rows of enormous stone figures standing silently along the coastline, their backs to the sea, their massive heads crowned with red stone cylinders, they were stunned. They could not comprehend what they were seeing. They could not understand how such a thing was possible. Roggeveen wrote in his ship's log that the statues appeared to be made of clay or some form of rich earth, because he could not believe that stone could be worked into such enormous shapes by any people lacking metal tools, lacking wheels, lacking draft animals, lacking all of the technological advantages that European civilization took for granted. He assumed it was some kind of trick, some illusion. It was not. The statues were solid volcanic rock, carved from the compressed volcanic ash of a quarry high on the slopes of a volcano called Raraku, and they had been standing there for centuries before his arrival. The question that seized Roggeveen's imagination, and that has seized the imagination of every visitor, every explorer, every scientist, every casual observer who has encountered the Moai in the 300 years since, is devastatingly simple. How did they do it? How did a small population on a remote island, with no metal, no wheels, no pulleys, no cranes, no draft animals, no written engineering manuals, no contact with any other civilization? How did they carve nearly 1,000 giant stone statues, move them miles across rugged volcanic terrain, and erect them upon platforms with such precision that many remained standing for hundreds of years? The answer to that question has taken centuries to piece together, and even now, parts of the puzzle remain incomplete. But what we have learned through archaeology, through experimental science, through the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people themselves, and through the sheer stubborn dedication of researchers who have devoted their lives to this mystery, is a story more remarkable, more nuanced, and more deeply human than any of the wild theories that have been proposed over the years. This is not a story about aliens. This is not a story about lost continents. This is not a story about supernatural forces. This is a story about people, real people, brilliant people, determined people who achieved something magnificent against extraordinary odds and who then watched it all come crashing down. Let us begin at the beginning. To understand the Moai, you must first understand the people who made them, and to understand the people, you must first understand how they got there. The colonization of Easter Island is itself one of the great achievements of human exploration and navigation, and it sets the stage for everything that followed. The people of Rapa Nui are Polynesian. Their ancestors came from the vast constellation of island societies scattered across the Pacific Ocean, the same seafaring culture that colonized Hawaii, New Zealand, Tahiti, Samoa, Tonga, the Marquesas, and dozens of other island groups spread across an oceanic area larger than all of the world's continents combined. The Polynesians were, without exaggeration, the greatest ocean navigators the world has ever known. Long before European sailors dared to venture out of sight of their coastlines, Polynesian voyagers were crossing thousands of miles of open ocean in double-hulled sailing canoes, navigating by the stars, the currents, the patterns of waves, the flight paths of birds, the shapes of clouds, and a deep, sophisticated understanding of the sea that was passed down orally from generation to generation. The exact date of the first human arrival on Easter Island has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. For many years, the prevailing estimate placed initial colonization somewhere around 800 to 1,000 years ago, roughly between the years 900 and 1200 of the Common Era. Radiocarbon dating of early settlement sites, analysis of pollen cores taken from the island's volcanic crater lakes, and genetic studies of the Rapa Nui population have all contributed to refining this timeline. The most current and widely accepted archaeological evidence suggests that the first settlers arrived sometime around the year 1100 to 1200, though some researchers argue for an earlier date, and the question remains open. What is not in dispute is where they came from. Linguistic analysis, DNA studies, and the material culture of early Rapa Nui settlement sites all point clearly to eastern Polynesia, most likely the Marquesas Islands or the Gambier Islands, as the homeland of the founding population. These voyagers would have traveled approximately 2,000 miles across open ocean to reach Easter Island, a journey that, even with favorable winds and currents, would have taken weeks. They would have carried with them everything needed to establish a new colony: men, women, children, seeds, plants, chickens, and the accumulated knowledge of a seafaring people stretching back thousands of years. Try to imagine it. Try to place yourself in that canoe. You have left behind everything you know: your home island, your extended family, the familiar stars over your familiar lagoon. You are sailing into the unknown. You have no map. You have no compass. You have no guarantee that there is anything out there at all. You are staking your life and the lives of everyone aboard on the belief, perhaps based on the observation of migrating birds, perhaps based on the testimony of a previous voyager, perhaps based on nothing more than courage and faith, that there is land ahead somewhere beyond the horizon. And after weeks of sailing, after storms and calms and the slow, grinding anxiety of open ocean, you see it, a dark smudge on the horizon: land. You have found Easter Island. The island that greeted those first settlers was very different from the barren, windswept grassland that Roggeveen would encounter centuries later. Pollen core samples taken from the sediment at the bottom of the island's crater lakes tell us that when the first Polynesians arrived, Rapa Nui was covered in forest. The dominant tree species was a giant palm, related to the Chilean wine palm, that grew up to 65 feet tall with trunks up to 7 feet in diameter. These palms, along with at least 20 other species of native trees and shrubs, formed a lush subtropical forest that covered much of the island's surface. The forest supported a diverse ecosystem of land birds, seabirds, and insects, and the surrounding waters were rich with fish and marine life. The settlers would have recognized this landscape as hospitable, if different from their home islands. They planted the crops they had brought: sweet potatoes, taro, yams, bananas, sugarcane, and they released their chickens. They built houses, established villages, and began the slow, patient work of turning a wild island into a home. Archaeological evidence from the earliest settlement layers shows a people adapting to their new environment, learning its rhythms, exploiting its resources, and beginning to develop the social and cultural systems that would define Rapa Nui civilization. The population grew, slowly at first, as any small founding population must, but steadily. Estimates of the island's peak population vary widely among researchers. Some scholars have proposed that the island eventually supported as many as 15,000 people, while others argue for a more conservative peak of around 6,000 to 9,000. Whatever the exact number, it is clear that over the course of several centuries, the Rapa Nui people built a thriving and complex society. They divided the island into a series of territorial units, each controlled by a clan or lineage group. These clans, the archaeological and oral historical record, identifies approximately 11 or 12 of them. Each occupied a wedge-shaped territory that typically ran from the coast inland toward the island's central volcanic highlands, ensuring that each clan had access to both coastal marine resources and interior agricultural land. The social structure of Rapa Nui was hierarchical. At the top sat the paramount chief, the Erection, who claimed descent from the island's legendary founder, Hatumata. Below the Erection were the chiefs of individual clans, and below them were priests, master craftsmen, warriors, and commoners. This was not a casual arrangement. The social hierarchy was deeply embedded in the Rapa Nui worldview, tied to concepts of mana, spiritual power, and authority that were inherited through lineage and demonstrated through achievement. And the most visible, most dramatic, most awe-inspiring demonstration of mana in all of Rapa Nui society was the carving, transport, and erection of the moai. The moai were not mere decoration. They were not public art in the way a modern person might understand the term. They were, in the deepest sense, sacred objects, embodiments of ancestral power. Each moai represented a deified ancestor, a chief or important figure who had died and whose spiritual power, whose mana, could be channeled back into the community through the statue. The moai were believed to be vessels for this mana. When a moai was completed, transported to its designated location, and erected upon its ahu, the stone platform on which it stood, and when the eyes were finally carved and the white coral and red scoria pupils were set into place, the statue was believed to come alive in a spiritual sense. It was no longer a block of stone. It was a living conduit of ancestral power, projecting its mana outward across the land over the village, protecting and empowering the people of the clan that had commissioned it. This is why the moai face inland. This is one of the great questions that visitors always ask, and the answer is both simple and profound. They face inland because they are watching over their descendants. They are not looking out to sea for approaching enemies or distant lands. They are looking inward toward the villages, toward the people, toward the living community that they are spiritually protecting. The moai stand with their backs to the ocean and their faces to the land because their purpose is to channel mana, ancestral spiritual energy, onto the clan's territory and its people. Every moai is a guardian. Every moai is an ancestor. Every moai is watching. The sole exception to this inward-facing orientation is the group of 7 moai at a site called Ahuakivi, located in the island's interior rather than on the coast. These 7 statues face toward the sea, and they are the only moai on the island to do so. Various explanations have been proposed for this anomaly. Some researchers suggest that these statues represent the 7 legendary scouts sent by Hatumata to find the island before the main colonizing voyage. Others note that these particular moai are oriented to face the point on the horizon where the sun sets during the equinox, suggesting an astronomical purpose. Whatever the specific explanation, the exception only underscores the rule. The overwhelming majority of the island's moai were erected on coastal platforms, facing inland, watching over the land and its people. Now let us talk about the statues themselves. The moai are magnificent. There is simply no other word for them. Even in photographs, even in replicas, they command attention. But to see them in person, to stand at the base of a row of restored moai on their ahu, and look up at those enormous, impassive faces staring silently over your head into the distance, is an experience that defies easy description. They are monumental in scale, haunting in their stillness, and deeply, inexplicably moving. Something about them reaches across the centuries and speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit. The typical moai is a large humanoid figure, carved from a single block of volcanic tuff, a compressed volcanic ash that is relatively soft and workable when first quarried but hardens with exposure to air. The figures are rendered in a distinctive, highly stylized manner. The heads are disproportionately large relative to the bodies, accounting for roughly 3/8 of the total height. The faces are elongated, with heavy brow ridges, long noses, thin lips set in an expression that is neither smiling nor frowning but simply present and prominent, jutting chins. The ears are elongated, a feature that reflects the Rapa Nui practice of stretching the earlobes with heavy ornaments. The arms are carved in low relief against the sides of the body, with hands positioned across the lower abdomen, fingers sometimes meeting at a stylized navel. The body typically ends at about the level of the hips or upper thighs, without legs, though the proportions suggest a standing figure truncated at the waist. Many moai originally wore Pukao, large cylindrical or somewhat rounded topknots carved from red scoria, a different type of volcanic rock quarried from a small crater called Pukao, located several miles from the main moai quarry. These Pukao, which could weigh several tons each, represented the topknot hairstyle worn by Rapa Nui men, in which the hair was gathered and tied in a knot on top of the head, sometimes colored with red pigment. The red color of the scoria was symbolically significant, as red was associated with mana and chiefly power throughout Polynesia. And then there were the eyes. The moai as we see them today are eyeless, smooth, blank depressions where the eyes should be, and this gives them their characteristic eerie, distant expression. But the original, completed moai had eyes. The eye sockets were designed to hold inlaid eyes made of white coral, with pupils of red scoria or black obsidian. These eyes were the final element to be added when a moai was erected on its ahu, and their insertion was believed to activate the statue, to open its eyes, literally and spiritually, and allow the mana of the ancestor to flow through it. Most of these coral eyes have been lost or destroyed over the centuries, but a few surviving examples have been found by archaeologists, and they are extraordinary, large, staring, slightly unsettling in their intensity. One particularly well-preserved coral eye, discovered in 1978 at the site of Ahu now on Anakna Beach, gave researchers their first definitive proof that the moai had originally been designed with inlaid eyes, solving a mystery that had puzzled scholars for decades. The statues vary considerably in size. The smallest completed moai are only about 4 feet tall. The largest moai ever successfully erected on an ahu is known as Paro, located at Ahu Te Pito Cura on the island's north coast. Paro stands approximately 33 feet tall and weighs an estimated 82 tons. Its Pukao alone weighs approximately 11 tons, but even Paro is not the largest moai ever carved. That distinction belongs to an incomplete statue still attached to the bedrock in the quarry at Rano, Raraku. Known as El Gigant, the giant, this unfinished colossus would have stood approximately 72 feet tall and weighed an estimated 145 to 165 tons had it ever been completed. It was never finished, never detached from the rock, never transported. It lies there still, a monument to ambition that outstripped even the remarkable capabilities of its creators. Some researchers believe that El Gigante could never have been moved with the technology available to the Rapa Nui, and that its carving represents either a ritual act never intended for completion or a project abandoned when the impracticality of its scale became apparent. The average moai, however, is more modest, approximately 13 feet tall and weighing around 13 tons. Even at this average size, they are enormously impressive objects, and the logistics of carving, transporting, and erecting nearly 1,000 of them over a period of several centuries represents an engineering and organizational achievement of the first order. And this brings us to the Quarry, the place where the moai were born, Raraku. Raraku is a volcanic crater located on the eastern side of the island, roughly in the center of the island's southern coast. It is the source of approximately 95% of all moai ever carved. The volcano's slopes are composed of a particular type of volcanic tuff, compressed and solidified volcanic ash that is remarkably well suited for carving. It is relatively soft when first exposed but hardens significantly over time when exposed to air and rain, making it an ideal medium for large-scale sculpture. The Rapa Nui master carvers recognized this quality and made Raraku their primary workshop. Visiting Raraku today is one of the most extraordinary archaeological experiences available anywhere on Earth. The slopes of the volcano are littered with nearly 400 moai in various stages of completion. Some are still attached to the bedrock, their faces emerging from the rock as if in the act of being born. Some are nearly complete, lying on their backs in their carved niches, waiting to be detached from the stone below them. Some have been detached and moved partway down the slope, standing upright in the earth, buried up to their chests or necks in centuries of accumulated sediment, giving the misleading impression of giant heads without bodies, the iconic image that most people associate with Easter Island. In fact, these are full statues, complete with torsos and arms, simply buried by soil erosion over time. The quarry at Raraku is essentially a snapshot of a vast industrial operation frozen in mid-production. It is as if the workers simply put down their tools one day and walked away, leaving hundreds of statues in every conceivable stage of manufacture. And in a sense, that is exactly what happened, but we will come to that. The carving process itself has been reconstructed through careful archaeological study of the quarry, the tools found there, and experimental archaeology, modern attempts to replicate the carving methods using the same types of tools and materials available to the Rapa Nui. The primary carving tool was the toki, a hand-held pick or adze made from basalt, a hard volcanic stone found abundantly on the island. Thousands of these toki have been found at Raraku, scattered across the quarry floor, discarded when they became dull or broken. The sheer number of discarded toki gives some indication of the scale of the carving enterprise. Basalt is much harder than the tuff being carved, making it an effective tool, but it still wore down and broke frequently, and new toki had to be constantly manufactured. The carving process began with the selection of a suitable section of rock face on the slopes of Raraku. Master carvers, specialists who held an honored position in Rapa Nui society, would identify a section of tuff of appropriate size and quality, free of significant cracks or inclusions that might weaken the finished statue. The outline of the moai would then be sketched or scored into the rock face, and teams of carvers would begin the laborious work of chipping away the surrounding stone to free the figure from the bedrock. The carving was done from the front and sides first. The face, the torso, the arms, and the detailed surface decoration were all carved, while the statue was still attached to the bedrock along its back. This meant that the carvers worked in confined spaces, narrow channels cut into the rock alongside the emerging figure, swinging their basalt toki in rhythmic, repetitive strokes, hour after hour, day after day, gradually revealing the moai from the stone like Michelangelo's famous description of sculpture as the art of removing everything that is not the statue. Experimental archaeology has given us some sense of the time required. In 1955, the Norwegian explorer and archaeologist Thor Heyerdahl, a controversial but undeniably energetic figure in Easter Island research, organized an experiment in which a team of Rapa Nui men attempted to carve a moai using traditional basalt toki. Based on the rate of progress they achieved, Heyerdahl estimated that a team of approximately 6 skilled carvers, working in shifts, could complete an average-sized moai in approximately 12 to 15 months. More recent estimates, based on more sophisticated analysis, suggest a range of 1 to 2 years for a typical statue, depending on its size and the number of carvers employed. The amount of rock that had to be removed was staggering. For each moai, many tons of tuff had to be chipped away and cleared. The quarry shows evidence of systematic, organized work, channels and niches carved in regular patterns, waste rock cleared to specific dumping areas, evidence of water being used to soften the tuff in some cases. This was not random, opportunistic stone bashing. This was organized industrial production, directed by skilled specialists, and supported by a society capable of dedicating significant labor resources to a non-subsistence activity over extended periods. Once the front and sides of the moai were complete, every detail of the face and body carved and finished, the critical and dangerous final step of the quarrying process began. The statue had to be detached from the bedrock along its back. This was accomplished by carving away the rock beneath the statue along a keel-shaped ridge, gradually reducing the attachment point until the statue could be broken free and lowered down the slope to a standing position. This was the most perilous moment in the life of a moai. A mistake at this stage, a crack in the wrong place, a miscalculation in the angle of detachment, could destroy months or years of work. And indeed, the quarry at Rano, Raraku contains several moai that cracked or broke during this process, abandoned where they lay, irreparable monuments to the risks inherent in the enterprise. Those statues that survived the detachment process were then slid down the slopes of Rano, Raraku to a staging area at the base of the volcano, where they were erected in temporary positions, standing upright in holes dug into the soft ground, for what appears to have been a period of final finishing and preparation. It is these temporarily erected statues, buried over time by sediment washing down the slopes, that create the famous image of the giant heads protruding from the hillside. And it is from this staging area that the moai began the most remarkable phase of their journey, the long overland transport from the quarry to their final destinations at ahu platforms scattered around the island's coastline. The question of how the moai were transported is the great riddle of Easter Island, the question that has generated more debate, more theories, more heated arguments, and more outright nonsense than any other aspect of the island's history. It is the question that led to claims of alien intervention, lost technologies, and supernatural powers. It is also the question that in recent decades has produced some of the most brilliant and convincing experimental archaeology ever conducted. Let us consider the scale of the problem. The quarry at Rano, Raraku is located on the eastern side of the island. The ahu platforms to which the moai were transported are distributed around the entire coastline, with some located more than 11 miles from the quarry. The terrain between the quarry and the various ahu sites is not flat. It is rough, uneven volcanic landscape with rocky ground, slopes, gullies, and occasional steep grades. The average moai weighs 13 tons, and some of the largest transported statues weigh upward of 80 tons. There are no navigable rivers or waterways on the island. The Rapa Nui had no wheels, no axles, no pulleys, no metal tools, no draft animals. They had stone, wood, rope, and human muscle, that is all. Over the years, a remarkable number of theories have been proposed to explain how the moai were moved. These theories can be broadly divided into several categories. The first and most enduring category involves the use of wooden sledges, rollers, or some combination of the two. The basic idea is straightforward. Lay the moai on its back or face on a wooden sledge or cradle, place the sledge on a track of wooden rollers, and use ropes and human muscle to drag the assembly forward, with workers constantly moving rollers from the back to the front as the statue advances. This method has the virtue of being relatively simple and well attested in other ancient megalithic construction projects around the world. Large stones for the Egyptian pyramids, for Stonehenge, and for numerous other ancient monuments are believed to have been moved using variants of this technique. Thor Heyerdahl, during his 1955 expedition, organized a demonstration in which a team of approximately 180 Rapa Nui Islanders successfully dragged a medium-sized moai on a wooden sledge across a short distance of flat ground using ropes. The demonstration proved that the concept was physically feasible, at least in principle. However, it also highlighted the enormous amount of labor required and, crucially, the enormous amount of wood. The sledge and roller method demands a substantial and continuous supply of large timber, both for the sledge itself and for the dozens or hundreds of rollers needed over a distance of several miles. This brings us to one of the most troubling and important aspects of the Easter Island story, the deforestation. Remember the forests that greeted the first settlers, the island that was covered in giant palms and other trees when the Polynesians arrived was, by the time the Europeans arrived in 1722, almost entirely treeless. The great palm forests were gone. The native trees were gone. The island was covered in grass and low scrub, with virtually no trees of any significant size. This deforestation, its causes, its timeline, and its consequences, is central to the story of the Moai and to the larger story of Rapa Nui civilization. Pollen core samples from the island's crater lakes provide a remarkably detailed record of the island's vegetation history. These cores show that the giant palm and other native tree species were abundant for thousands of years before human arrival, and that they began to decline sharply after the first settlers arrived. The decline accelerated over the following centuries, and by approximately 1600, roughly a century before European contact, the native forest was effectively gone. The causes of the deforestation were multiple and interrelated. The Rapa Nui cleared forest for agriculture to create fields for their crops, particularly sweet potatoes, which became the staple food of the island. They used wood for building houses, canoes, fuel for cooking, and for the various implements of daily life. They used it for the transport of the moai, whether as sledges, rollers, levers, or some combination of these. And critically, the Polynesian rat, the kior, which arrived with the first settlers as either a stowaway or a deliberate import. Rats were a food source in some Polynesian cultures, fed voraciously on the palm nuts of the native trees, preventing regeneration and accelerating the forest's decline. The deforestation was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow, grinding process that unfolded over centuries, but its consequences were profound. Without large trees, the Rapa Nui could no longer build seagoing canoes, cutting them off from deep-sea fishing and, more significantly, from any possibility of voyaging to other islands. They were trapped. They also lost a source of building material, fuel, and most critically for our story, the timber needed to transport the moai. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return to the question of transport. The second major category of transport theories involves the use of ropes alone, without sledges or rollers. In these scenarios, the moai is moved in an upright or semi-upright position, rocked, tilted, or walked forward using ropes attached at various points. This general concept has a powerful piece of evidence in its favor, the oral tradition of the Rapa Nui people themselves. When early European visitors and later ethnographers asked the Rapa Nui how the moai had been moved, the answer they received was consistent and unequivocal. The statues walked. The moai walked from the quarry to their platforms. They walked. For a long time, outside researchers dismissed this claim as myth, legend, or metaphor. How could a 13-ton stone statue walk? It seemed absurd. But as our understanding of the Rapa Nui and their culture has deepened, and as experimental evidence has accumulated, the walking theory has gained remarkable credibility. The Rapa Nui were not speaking in metaphors. They were describing, in their own terms, a real physical process that, to an observer, would indeed have looked very much like walking. The walking theory received its most dramatic and convincing demonstration in 2011. when a team of researchers led by archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, working in collaboration with a National Geographic documentary crew, successfully walked a replica Moai, a concrete statue roughly 10 feet tall and weighing approximately 5 tons, along a road using nothing but ropes and a small team of people. The method was elegant and surprisingly simple. 3 teams of people held ropes attached to the statue, 1 team on each side and 1 team behind. The statue was tilted slightly to one side by the side teams, and then the rear team pulled it forward, causing it to pivot on its base and take a step. Then it was tilted to the other side, pulled forward again, and took another step. The motion was rocking, lurching, side to side, remarkably similar to the way a person might walk a heavy refrigerator across a room by tilting it from corner to corner. The statue moved forward at a rate that, extrapolated over a full day's work, could have covered a considerable distance. The experiment was electrifying. Here at last was a method that matched the oral tradition. The statues literally walked, and that required no wood, no sledges, no rollers. Required only ropes and people, both of which the Rapa Nui had in abundance even after the forests were gone. It also explained several archaeological observations that had previously been puzzling. Many of the fallen Moai found along the ancient roads, the statues that apparently broke or tipped over during transport and were abandoned where they fell, are found lying face down. If the statues had been transported lying flat on sledges, you would expect to find them lying on their backs or sides. But if they were being walked upright, a fall forward face down is exactly what you would expect when the rocking motion went wrong. Furthermore, the ancient roads along which the Moai were transported, visible in aerial photographs and confirmed by ground survey, show a distinctive pattern. They are not flat, leveled tracks of the type you would expect for sledge transport. Instead, they are slightly concave, with raised edges, creating a subtle V-shaped or U-shaped profile. Hunt and Lipo argue that this profile is consistent with a walking statue whose base would naturally cut into and compact the center of the road, while the teams of rope handlers walked along the raised edges. The walking theory also explains the shape of the Moai themselves. For years, researchers had puzzled over certain features of Moai design that seemed to serve no aesthetic purpose. The statues have a distinctive forward line. Their center of gravity is positioned slightly forward of center. Their bases are not flat but slightly rounded or D-shaped. These features, which would be disadvantageous if the statues were meant to be transported lying down, are precisely the features you would want in a statue designed to be walked upright. The forward lean creates a natural tendency to fall forward, which is counteracted by the rear rope team. The rounded base allows the statue to rock smoothly from side to side. The D shape of the base provides a stable pivot point. In other words, the Moai were not just statues that happened to be walked, they were engineered to walk. This is a profound insight, and it represents a fundamental shift in how we think about the Rapa Nui and their achievement. They were not merely strong and determined, hauling dead weight across the landscape through brute force. They were engineers. They designed their statues with transport in mind, building the transport mechanism into the very shape of the object being transported. This is sophisticated thinking. This is elegant problem solving. This is the kind of innovation that emerges from a culture deeply engaged with the physical challenges of its environment. However, and this is important, the walking theory is not universally accepted among researchers, and the debate continues. Other archaeologists, notably Jo Ann van Tilburg, who has spent decades cataloging and studying the Moai, favor a modified sledge and roller hypothesis based on their own experimental work and their interpretation of the archaeological evidence. Van Tilburg's experiments, conducted in the 1990s, involved dragging a replica Moai on a wooden sledge along a prepared road using log rollers, and she demonstrated that this method was also feasible with the available resources. She argues that the archaeological evidence along the ancient roads, including remnants of wooden debris and the pattern of fallen statues, is more consistent with horizontal transport on sledges than with upright walking. The truth may lie somewhere in between, or may involve methods that vary depending on the specific circumstances of each transport event. Some statues may have been walked, others may have been dragged on sledges. Some may have been moved using methods we have not yet identified or tested. The archaeological record is complex, and the transport of nearly 1,000 statues over a period of several centuries almost certainly involved experimentation, innovation, and the development of multiple techniques adapted to different statue sizes, distances, and terrain conditions. What is not in dispute is that they did it. By whatever method or combination of methods, the Rapa Nui moved hundreds of enormous stone statues from the quarry at Rano, Raraku, to platforms distributed around the entire coastline of the island. This is a fact, not a theory. The statues are there. They were carved there at the quarry, and they ended up there at the Ahu platforms miles away. They were moved by human beings using Stone Age technology, and the logistical, organizational, and social requirements of this achievement are staggering. Consider what it takes to move even a single moai. You need a team of skilled carvers to spend a year or more extracting the statue from the quarry. You need a supply chain providing those carvers with food and water and tools for the duration of the project. You need additional teams to prepare the transport route, clearing rocks, filling holes, perhaps building up the road surface. You need the transport team itself, dozens or possibly hundreds of people with ropes, coordinating their efforts over hours or days. You need the Ahu platform to be built or prepared at the destination, a massive construction project in itself, involving the quarrying, transport, and precise fitting of large stone blocks. You need the engineering knowledge to erect the statue on the platform. Raising a 13-ton stone from horizontal to vertical is no simple matter and requires careful planning, strong ropes, and either a ramp or a levering system. You need the Pukao to be carved at a separate quarry, transported to the site, and somehow lifted and placed on top of the already erected statue, adding several tons of weight to the top of a 30-foot column of stone. And you need to do all of this while simultaneously feeding the entire population, maintaining agricultural production, building and repairing houses, fishing, performing religious ceremonies, resolving disputes, raising children, and carrying out all the other activities necessary to sustain a functioning society on an isolated island. This is not the work of a few enthusiastic hobbyists. This is a massive, sustained, organized societal effort requiring coordination, leadership, resource management, and a deep, shared commitment to a common purpose. The moai were not built by slaves driven by whips. The archaeological evidence and the oral traditions suggest that moai carving and transport was a prestigious, honorable activity carried out by specialists who were supported by the community and who held a respected position in society. The master carvers were known as Tangata Maori Anga Moai, and their skill was recognized and valued. But the broader effort, the hundreds of people needed for transport, the food production needed to support them, the social organization needed to coordinate it all, required the participation and cooperation of the entire community, or at least a very large portion of it. The motivation for this enormous investment of labor was not economic in any direct sense. The moai did not produce food, they did not defend against enemies, they did not perform any practical function. Their purpose was spiritual and social. Each completed moai erected on its ahu and gazing inland over the clan's territory was a statement of power, prestige, and ancestral connection. It said, our ancestors are watching over us, our mana is strong, we have the resources, the skills, and the unity to create something magnificent. Look at what we have built. In this sense, the moai functioned as what anthropologists call prestige goods or competitive display. The clans of Rapa Nui were in competition with each other, not necessarily violent competition, at least not initially, but a competition for status, honor, and mana. A clan that erected a larger, more impressive moai than its neighbors was demonstrating its superiority. And this competition drove the escalation that we see in the archaeological record, statues getting bigger and bigger over time, reaching toward ever more ambitious scales, culminating in the 82-ton Paro and the never-completed 72-foot El Gigante. This pattern competitive monument building driven by inter-group rivalry is not unique to Easter Island. It has been observed in many societies throughout history. The cathedrals of medieval Europe, each one taller and more elaborate than the last, were driven in part by civic competition between rival cities. The temples of ancient Egypt grew ever larger across the dynasties, but what makes the Easter Island case so striking is the extreme isolation and limited resources of the setting. This was not a vast empire with unlimited labor and materials. This was a small island with a limited population, limited resources, and no access to outside support. And yet they pushed themselves to extraordinary heights, literally, in the pursuit of monumental achievement. Let us now turn to the Ahu, the platforms on which the Moai were erected, because the Moai were only half of the equation. Without the Ahu, they were merely statues. It was the combination of Moai and Ahu that created the sacred, powerful ensemble that was the centerpiece of Rapa Nui religious and social life. The Ahu are large stone platforms, constructed along the coastline, typically at or near the shore. They vary in size from relatively modest structures supporting a single small Moai to enormous complexes supporting 15 or more statues. The largest and most impressive Ahu on the island is Ahu Tongariki, located on the southeast coast near the quarry at Rano, Raraku. Ahu Tongariki is a massive platform approximately 720 feet long, upon which 15 Moai once stood in a row. The platform itself is a sophisticated stone construction, built from carefully fitted blocks of basalt and other volcanic stone, with an inland-facing front wall, a seaward-facing back wall, and a flat top upon which the Moai were erected. Wings extend from either end of the main platform, creating a large enclosed plaza or ceremonial area in front of the statues. The construction of an Ahu was a major engineering project, in some ways more complex than the carving of the Moai themselves. The foundation had to be prepared, leveled, and stabilized. Large stone blocks had to be quarried, transported, and fitted together, in some cases with remarkable precision, using the same kind of tight-fitting, mortar-free stone joinery found in Inca constructions in South America. Some Ahu incorporate blocks weighing several tons. The platform had to be built to support the enormous weight of one or more Moai, each weighing many tons plus their Pukao. And it had to be oriented correctly, aligned with the coastline, facing inland, and in some cases aligned with specific astronomical events such as solstices or equinoxes. Many Ahu also served as burial sites. The platforms contained or were associated with burial chambers or cremation pits where the remains of the dead were interred. This dual function, as both a display platform for the Moai and a burial site for ancestors, reinforces the connection between the statues and the ancestral cult. The dead were buried at the base of the very statues that represented their deified ancestors, creating a physical as well as spiritual link between the living, the recently dead, and the ancient ancestral spirits. The archaeological record shows that Ahu construction and Moai carving evolved over time. Early Ahu, dating to the first centuries of settlement, were relatively simple structures, low platforms, sometimes without Moai, serving primarily as burial and ceremonial sites. Over time, the platforms became larger and more elaborate, and the addition of Moai became standard. The Moai themselves evolved in style. Early statues tend to be smaller, more rounded, and less standardized, while later statues conform more closely to the tall, angular, large-headed form that we think of as the classic Moai style. The peak period of Moai construction is generally believed to have been between approximately 1300 and 1500 of the Common Era, a period of roughly 200 years during which the most and largest statues were carved and transported. The number of Moai that were actually completed, transported, and erected on Ahu is smaller than the total number carved. Of the approximately 1,000 Moai known to exist on the island, only about 300 to 400 were successfully transported to Ahu platforms and erected. The remainder are found either at the quarry at Rano, Raraku, in various stages of completion, or along the ancient roads between the quarry and the various Ahu sites where they apparently fell, broke, or were abandoned during transport. This failure rate, roughly 50 to 60%, gives us some sense of the difficulty and risk involved in the transport process. For every statue that made it to its destination, roughly one did not. The ones that did not make it are themselves important archaeological evidence. The fallen roadside moai, broken, tilted, face down in the dirt, are silent witnesses to transport attempts that went wrong. Some cracked during the initial detachment from the quarry. Some broke during the journey across the landscape. Some toppled and could not be re-erected with the available labor and equipment. Each fallen moai represents a failed investment of perhaps a year or more of labor by dozens or hundreds of people. Each one represents a loss not just of material and effort, but of prestige and mana. For a clan that had commissioned a moai and then failed to deliver it to its ahu, the humiliation must have been significant, yet they kept doing it. For centuries, they kept carving, kept transporting, kept building. The drive to create the moai was so powerful, so deeply embedded in the social and spiritual fabric of Rapa Nui society, that failure was simply absorbed and the effort renewed. A fallen statue was abandoned and a new one begun. A broken moai was left where it lay and the carvers returned to the quarry to start again. The mountain of Rano, Raraku, was slowly consumed, statue by statue, as generations of carvers cut deeper and deeper into its slopes, and then they stopped. This is one of the most dramatic and poignant aspects of the Easter Island story. After centuries of continuous moai production, the carving and transport of statues ceased. The quarry at Rano, Raraku, was abandoned. Tools were left scattered on the ground. Unfinished statues were left in their niches. Statues in various stages of transport were left standing or lying along the roads. The entire monumental industry, the defining activity of Rapa Nui civilization, simply stopped. When did this happen? The precise dating is difficult, but the archaeological evidence and radiocarbon dating suggest that moai production ended sometime in the late 16th or early 17th century, roughly 100 to 150 years before European contact. The cessation was apparently quite abrupt. There is no evidence of a gradual decline in production, no evidence of statues getting smaller or less elaborate over the final period. The last statues being carved at the quarry include some of the largest ever attempted. The industry went from full production to complete cessation in what appears to have been a relatively short time. Why did they stop? This is where the story of the moai intersects with the larger story of Rapa Nui civilization, a story of environmental change, social upheaval, and cultural transformation. And it is a story that we must tell carefully because it has been badly told in the past. For many years, the dominant narrative about Easter Island was a story of ecological catastrophe and civilizational collapse, a cautionary tale about the dangers of environmental destruction. The story went like this. The Rapa Nui, driven by the obsessive competition to build ever larger moai, stripped their island bare of trees. They cut down every last palm to make rollers and sledges for transporting the statues. In doing so, they destroyed their environment, ruined their soil, eliminated their ability to build canoes, wiped out their native birds and other wildlife, and triggered a catastrophic decline in food production. Starvation followed. The social order collapsed. The clans turned on each other in vicious warfare. The moai, the symbols of the old order, were deliberately toppled by rival clans, pulled down from their ahu and left lying face down in the dirt. Cannibalism ensued. The population plummeted from perhaps 15,000 to just a few thousand. By the time the Europeans arrived in 1722, they found a devastated landscape populated by an impoverished remnant of a once great civilization, living among the ruins of their ancestors' achievements, unable to explain how the great statues had been built, having lost even the memory of their own greatness. This narrative, which was popularized most notably by the geographer Jared Diamond in his 2005 book Collapse, is dramatic, compelling, and deeply satisfying as a parable. It offers a clear moral: destroy your environment and you destroy yourself. It presents the Rapa Nui as both magnificent achievers and tragic fools undone by their own excess. and it contains elements of truth. The deforestation was real. The environmental degradation was real. The social disruption was real. The toppling of the Moai was real. But the full story is more complicated and in many ways more interesting than the simple collapse narrative suggests. Recent research has significantly revised our understanding of what happened on Easter Island, and the revised picture is both more nuanced and in some respects more hopeful. Let us look at the evidence more carefully. The deforestation of Easter Island was real and severe, and it did have significant environmental and social consequences. But it was not simply a result of reckless tree cutting for Moai transport. As noted earlier, multiple factors contributed to the loss of the forest, agricultural clearing, the use of wood for various purposes, and critically, the impact of the Polynesian rat on tree regeneration. Recent research suggests that the rats may have been an even more significant factor than human tree cutting, consuming the nuts and seeds of the native palms so voraciously that the trees could not reproduce, even in areas that were not being actively cleared by humans. Furthermore, the Rapa Nui did not simply watch their environment collapse and do nothing. The archaeological evidence shows that as the forest declined, the Rapa Nui adapted. They developed sophisticated agricultural techniques to maintain food production in the face of deteriorating soil conditions. One of their most important innovations was lithic mulching, the practice of scattering broken rocks and small stones across their agricultural fields. This technique, which is well documented in the archaeological record, served multiple purposes. The stones reduced wind erosion of the soil. They reduced evaporation, helping to retain moisture. They moderated soil temperature fluctuations, and as the stones slowly weathered, they released minerals that helped to fertilize the soil. This was not a desperate last-ditch measure. It was a thoughtful, effective agricultural adaptation that allowed the Rapa Nui to maintain food production even as their environment changed. They also built man-of-ice stone-walled garden enclosures that protected crops from wind and salt spray, creating sheltered microclimates for growing more delicate plants. And they developed chicken husbandry to an unusual degree, building elaborate stone chicken houses, hermoa, that dot the landscape and that served as secure enclosures for what had become one of the island's most important protein sources. The population decline that undoubtedly occurred on Rapa Nui may also have been less catastrophic and less sudden than the traditional collapse narrative suggests. Some researchers now argue that the population decline was gradual, driven more by the slow degradation of resources and the cumulative effects of environmental change than by a sudden, dramatic crash. Others argue that a significant population decline did occur but was not as extreme as previously estimated because the peak population itself may have been lower than the highest estimates, perhaps 6,000 to 9,000 rather than 15,000. And then there is the question of European contact. This is a crucial and often underemphasized factor in the story of Easter Island. When the Europeans arrived in 1722, they did not merely observe a civilization in decline, they actively contributed to its destruction. In the decades and centuries following first contact, European and other outsiders brought diseases to which the Rapa Nui had no immunity: smallpox, tuberculosis, syphilis, and others that devastated the population. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders kidnapped approximately 1,500 Rapa Nui, roughly a third of the remaining population, and transported them to work in the guano mines of Peru's Chincha Islands. Most of them died. The few survivors who were eventually repatriated brought smallpox back to the island, triggering a further epidemic. By 1877, the population of Rapa Nui had been reduced to just 111 people. 111. From a pre-contact population of perhaps 6,000 to 9,000, the Rapa Nui were reduced to barely more than 100 souls. This catastrophic population collapse, which was primarily caused by European diseases and slave raiding, not by indigenous environmental destruction, obliterated much of the island's oral history, cultural knowledge, and social structure. the elders who held the traditions died. The experts who could read the Rongorongo script, the mysterious undeciphered writing system of Rapa Nui, which is found inscribed on wooden tablets and which remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of human communication, those experts died. The knowledge of how the Moai were carved and transported, the details of the ceremonies associated with them, the specific histories of each clan and each ahu, much of this knowledge died with the people who held it. When researchers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began trying to reconstruct the history of Easter Island, they were working with a population that had been reduced to a tiny fraction of its former size and that had lost much of its cultural memory. The stories they collected were fragmentary, contradictory, and filtered through the trauma of near extinction. And yet, even in these fragments, truth persisted. The Moai walked, that memory survived, and it turned out to be accurate. Now let us talk about the toppling. When Jacob Roggeveen visited Easter Island in 1722, he reported seeing statues standing upright on their platforms. When the British explorer James Cook visited in 1774, just 52 years later, he reported that many statues had been toppled, lying face down in front of their ahu. By the time the French navigator Jean-François de la Pérouse visited in 1786, more statues were down. And by the mid-19th century, not a single Moai on the entire island remained standing on its ahu. Everyone had been pulled down. The toppling of the Moai is one of the most dramatic and disturbing aspects of the Easter Island story, and it has been interpreted in various ways. The traditional narrative frames it as an act of iconoclasm, a deliberate destruction of the symbols of the old order during a period of social upheaval and inter-clan warfare. According to this interpretation, as the social and environmental crises of the 17th and 18th centuries intensified, the traditional religious and political system, the system based on mana, ancestral worship, and Moai construction, lost its legitimacy. The clans turned against each other, and one of the ways they expressed their hostility was by toppling the Moai of rival clans. To pull down an enemy's Moai was to destroy their mana, to humiliate their ancestors, to demonstrate power and contempt. It was an act of spiritual warfare as devastating as any physical attack. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation to a considerable degree. The toppled Moai are found lying face down in front of their ahu, which is consistent with being pulled forward off the platform, face down, so that the ancestor can no longer see, no longer project its mana, no longer watch over the land. In many cases, the ahu themselves show evidence of being deliberately dismantled or modified, stones removed, burial chambers disturbed, and in some cases, the platforms rebuilt into different configurations. The deliberate nature of the toppling is further suggested by the fact that the Pukao, the Topknots, are typically found displaced from the statues, rolled away or broken, suggesting that the Topknots were removed or knocked off before or during the toppling. However, some researchers have suggested that not all of the toppling was deliberate. Some Moai may have fallen due to earthquakes. Easter Island is located in a seismically active region, and significant earthquakes have been recorded in historical times. The 1960 Chilean earthquake, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded, generated a tsunami that struck Easter Island and displaced several Moai at Ahu Tongariki, demonstrating the vulnerability of the statues to seismic events. It is possible that some of the pre-European toppling was similarly caused by natural events rather than human action. Still, the weight of evidence suggests that most of the toppling was deliberate and that it occurred over a period spanning the late 17th century through the early 19th century. The toppling was part of a broader cultural transformation in which the old religion, centered on ancestral worship, Moai construction, and the Erection was replaced by a new religious and political system centered on a different kind of competition. This new system was the Tangata Manu, the Birdman Cult. And it represents one of the most fascinating cultural transformations in the history of the Pacific. The Birdman Cult centered on an annual competition held at the ceremonial village of Orongo, perched on the knife-edge rim of the Rano volcanic crater on the island's southwestern tip. Each year, representatives of the competing clans would gather at Orongo to participate in a dangerous and dramatic contest. The goal was to obtain the first egg of the sooty tern, a migratory seabird that nested on a small islet called Rapa Nui, located just offshore at the base of the towering sea cliffs below Orongo. The competitors, or more precisely, their chosen representatives called hapu, would climb down the sheer, 300-meter cliffs of Rano, swim through shark-infested waters to Rapa Nui, and wait, sometimes for weeks, for the sooty terns to arrive and begin laying. The first hapu to find an egg would strap it to his forehead in a special headband, swim back through the surf, climb the cliffs, and deliver the egg to his sponsor, who would then be declared the Tangata Manu, the Birdman, for that year. The Tangata Manu held a position of great power and prestige for the duration of his reign. The competition replaced the old system of hereditary chieftainship based on ancestral mana with a more dynamic, competitive system in which political power was won annually through physical prowess and luck. The Birdman Cult represented a fundamental shift in Rapa Nui society, a shift away from the ancestral worship system that had driven Moai construction and toward a new form of political and religious organization. The rise of the Birdman Cult and the toppling of the Moai are closely linked. As the old system lost legitimacy, whether due to environmental stress, population pressure, social inequality, or some combination of these factors, the Moai, which were the physical embodiment of that system, became targets. They were not merely abandoned, they were actively destroyed. Their toppling was not just an act of vandalism or warfare. It was a revolutionary act, a repudiation of the old order and an embrace of something new. This transformation from Moai-centered ancestral worship to the Birdman Cult is sometimes presented as evidence of societal collapse, as proof that Rapa Nui civilization was falling apart, but another reading is possible. The Birdman Cult can also be seen as evidence of societal adaptation, a creative response to changing circumstances, a new political and religious system that addressed the failures and inequalities of the old one. The Rapa Nui did not simply collapse, they changed, they evolved, they found new ways to organize their society and express their spirituality. The Moai era ended, but Rapa Nui culture continued. Now let us step back and consider the broader picture of what was happening on this island across the centuries, the full arc of the civilization that created the Moai. The story begins with arrival, those first canoes reaching the island's shores sometime around 1100 to 1200. The settlers found a forested, fertile island rich with birds and marine life. They established villages, cleared land for agriculture, and began the long process of building a new society from scratch. These early centuries were a period of growth, expansion, and cultural development. The population increased, the clan system took shape. The first ahu were built, and the first Moai were carved, small, relatively simple figures, experimental in form, as the carvers began to develop the techniques and styles that would eventually produce the monumental statues of the later period. By around 1300, the classic Moai style had emerged, and production was accelerating. The quarry at Rano, Raraku was in full operation, with dozens of statues being carved simultaneously. Transport teams were moving completed Moai to ahu sites around the island. The ahu themselves were growing larger and more elaborate. This was the golden age of Moai construction, a period of roughly 200 years, from about 1300 to about 1500, during which the majority of the island's statues were carved and erected. The competition between clans was intense, driving the production of ever larger and more impressive statues. The society was organized, productive, and by the standards of its own values, successful. But during this same period, the seeds of future problems were being sown. The forest was declining, the bird populations were shrinking, the soil was being depleted by centuries of agriculture. The rats continued their relentless consumption of palm nuts. Each year, the island had slightly fewer trees, slightly fewer birds, slightly less topsoil than the year before. The changes were slow, too slow perhaps for any individual to notice within a single lifetime, but cumulatively over generations they were transforming the island. By around 1500 to 1600, the environmental changes had become severe enough to have significant social consequences. The forests were nearly gone. Deep-sea fishing had become difficult or impossible without large timber for canoes. The bird populations had crashed, food production was under stress, and the social system, the system that demanded ever greater investment in Moai construction, was placing enormous demands on a resource base that could no longer support them. Something had to give, and it did. The exact sequence and timing of events during the transition period, roughly 1550 to 1700, remain subjects of active research and debate, but the broad outlines are clear. Moai production ceased, inter-clan conflict intensified. The old political and religious system, centered on the Raraku and the ancestral Moai, was challenged and eventually replaced by the Birdman Cult. The Moai began to be toppled. The society reorganized itself around new principles and new forms of competition. And then the Europeans came, and everything changed again, this time catastrophically. The arrival of Europeans on Rapa Nui, beginning with Roggeveen in 1722 and continuing with a succession of Spanish, British, French, and other visitors throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, introduced a new set of devastating pressures. Disease, violence, and exploitation took a terrible toll on the Rapa Nui people. The slave raids of 1862 were perhaps the single most destructive event in the island's post-contact history, but they were only the most dramatic of many blows. Missionaries arrived in the 1860s and converted the surviving population to Christianity, suppressing traditional beliefs and practices. Chilean authorities annexed the island in 1888 and subsequently leased most of the land to a sheep ranching company, confining the remaining Rapa Nui to a small area around the village of Hangaroa, and imposing restrictions on their movement and activities that persisted well into the 20th century. The result of all of this was that by the early 20th century, the Rapa Nui people, the descendants of the brilliant navigators, carvers, and engineers who had created the Moai, were a marginalized, impoverished community of a few hundred people living under foreign control on their own island, surrounded by the ruins of their ancestors' achievements, largely cut off from their own cultural heritage. But they survived. Against all odds, they survived. And in recent decades, a remarkable cultural revival has taken place on Rapa Nui. The population has grown to approximately 8,000 people today. Traditional language, arts, and cultural practices have been revived and celebrated. The Rapa Nui people have fought for and won greater control over their own island and their own heritage. And the Moai, those great stone ancestors who watched over the land for centuries, have been given new life. Several ahu have been restored and their Moai re-erected through a combination of archaeological research and community effort. The most dramatic of these restorations is Ahu Tongariki, where 15 Moai were re-erected in the 1990s after having been toppled during the island's turbulent history and further displaced by the 1960 tsunami. The restored Ahu Tongariki, with its row of 15 Moai standing once again against the sky, is one of the most powerful and moving sights in all of archaeology. These are the ancestors standing once more. They are watching over the land again. The study of the Moai and of Rapa Nui civilization continues, and new discoveries are being made regularly. In recent years, excavations at Rano, Raraku have revealed that the buried statues on the quarry slopes, the famous heads, have bodies that extend deep into the ground and that are covered with elaborate petroglyphs and carvings not visible above the surface. These discoveries have added new layers of meaning and complexity to our understanding of the statues and their role in Rapa Nui culture. Researchers have also made significant progress in understanding the Rongorongo script, the undeciphered writing system found on wooden tablets, believed to be one of very few independent inventions of writing in human history. Although the script has not yet been fully deciphered, Recent analyses using artificial intelligence and advanced statistical methods have identified patterns and possible structural features that may eventually lead to a breakthrough. And the debate over how the Moai were transported continues, enriched by new evidence and new experimental techniques. Recent geological and geochemical studies have allowed researchers to match specific Moai to specific quarry locations within Raraku, providing detailed maps of where each statue was carved and suggesting patterns in the quarrying process that shed light on the social organization of the carving enterprise. Studies of the ancient roads have revealed new details about their construction and maintenance, and about the patterns of statue transport, which routes were used most frequently, which direction the statues traveled, and where the most common failure points were located. The story of the Moai of Rapa Nui is far from over. New questions are being asked, new methods are being applied, and new answers are emerging. But even with all that we still do not know, what we do know is extraordinary. We know that a small group of Polynesian voyagers, sailing 2,000 miles across open ocean in wooden canoes, found a tiny island at the edge of the world and made it their home. We know that they built a complex, organized society with no outside contact, no external trade, and no knowledge of any other people on Earth. We know that they developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, a rich artistic and ceremonial culture, and a religious system centered on the worship of deified ancestors. We know that they carved nearly 1,000 giant stone statues, some weighing more than 80 tons from a volcanic quarry, transported them miles across the island using methods that we are still working to fully understand, and erected them on massive stone platforms along the coastline where they stood facing inland, channeling ancestral mana over the land and its people. We know that they did all of this with stone tools, plant fiber ropes, and human muscle. We know that they did it over a period of several centuries, sustaining a monumental building program that would be impressive for any society, let alone one as small and isolated as Rapa Nui. And we know that when their environment changed and their social system came under stress, they adapted not perfectly, not without suffering, but with creativity and resilience, finding new ways to organize their society and carry on. The Moai are many things. They are works of art, breathtaking in their scale and their stark, powerful beauty. They are feats of engineering, testaments to the ingenuity and determination of their creators. They are spiritual objects, vessels of ancestral power and guardians of a people. They are historical documents, recording in stone the rise and transformation of a civilization. And they are symbols, symbols of what human beings can achieve when they are driven by vision, faith, and the deep, inextinguishable urge to make their mark upon the world. But perhaps most of all, they are a reminder. A reminder that on a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from anywhere, a people without metal, without wheels, without written language, a people armed with nothing but their own intelligence, their own strength, their own creativity, and their own unshakable belief in themselves and their ancestors, did something that the rest of the world could not believe was possible. They carved giants out of the mountain, and the giants walked. Let us now go deeper into the specific archaeological evidence that has reshaped our understanding of the Moai and the civilization that created them. Because the story we have told so far is the broad sweep, the overview, the arc, the narrative. But within that narrative are hundreds of specific discoveries, specific sites, specific artifacts, and specific scientific analyses that have built our understanding piece by piece, each one adding a new detail, a new insight, a new complication to a picture that grows richer and more complex with every passing year. Let us start with the quarry itself, Raraku, because it is at the quarry that the story of each individual Moai began, and it is at the quarry that some of the most important recent discoveries have been made. Raraku is not a single quarry. It is a complex of quarrying areas spread across both the outer and inner slopes of the volcanic crater. The outer slopes facing outward toward the island were the primary quarrying zone, and it is here that the majority of the unfinished and in-progress Moai are found. but the inner slopes, facing inward toward the crater lake, were also quarried, and a number of moai were carved from this interior rock face as well. The tuff on the inner slopes is of slightly different composition and color than the outer slopes, and moai carved from the interior can sometimes be distinguished by their appearance. The quarrying was done at multiple levels on the slopes, with carvers working simultaneously on many different statues. Some areas of the quarry show evidence of systematic, top-down quarrying, removing statues from the upper portions of the rock face first and working downward, while other areas show a more opportunistic approach, with carvers selecting individual rock outcrops of suitable size and quality without apparent regard for a master plan. The tools of the quarry have been found in enormous numbers. Thousands of basalt toki, the stone picks used for carving, have been recovered from the quarry floor and from the sediment that has accumulated around the bases of unfinished statues. These toki range in size from small hand-held implements to larger, heavier tools that may have been used for roughing out the initial shape. Analysis of the basalt used for the toki shows that it came from several different sources around the island, suggesting that toki manufacture was itself a significant industry, with basalt being quarried, shaped, and transported to Raraku from distant sites. Water appears to have played an important role in the carving process. Several researchers have noted that water can significantly soften volcanic tuff, making it easier to carve. The quarry at Raraku would have had access to water from the crater lake, and some evidence suggests that carvers may have used water to soften the rock face before carving, or to keep the working surface damp during the carving process. This would have increased efficiency and reduced tool breakage, both significant considerations given the enormous volume of stone that had to be removed for each statue. One of the most important recent discoveries at Raraku involves the buried statues on the outer slopes, the famous heads that are actually complete figures buried by centuries of sediment. Excavations conducted by the Easter Island Statue Project, directed by Joanne van Tilburg, and by other research teams, have revealed that the buried portions of these statues are covered with petroglyphs, carved designs including crescents, canoes, and other symbols that appear to have been added to the statues while they stood in the quarry's staging area. These petroglyphs are not found on statues that were transported to Ahu sites, suggesting that they were specific to the quarry context, perhaps rituals or markings associated with the preparation of the statues for transport, or perhaps records of the clans or individuals involved in their creation. The excavations have also revealed that the soil surrounding the buried statues contains significant quantities of organic material, plant remains, charcoal, fragments of tapa cloth, suggesting that the staging area at the base of the quarry was not just a parking lot for statues awaiting transport, but an active ceremonial space where rituals, offerings, and perhaps feasting took place in connection with the statues. This aligns with the broader understanding of moai creation as a deeply spiritual as well as practical enterprise, in which every stage, quarrying, carving, transport, erection, was accompanied by ceremony and prayer. The roads along which the moai were transported have also been the subject of intensive recent study. These roads, known in Rapa Nui as Aramoe, the moai roads, radiate outward from Raraku in several directions, leading to Ahu sites around the island's coastline. They are not formal paved roads in the modern sense, but rather cleared and prepared pathways, typically 10 to 15 feet wide, that can be traced across the landscape through a combination of aerial photography, satellite imagery, ground survey, and the distribution of fallen roadside moai. The roads show several interesting features. As noted earlier, many have a slightly concave cross-section, consistent with the passage of walked statues. Some sections show evidence of deliberate preparation, the removal of large rocks, the filling of depressions, the leveling of slopes. In some areas, the roads follow the contours of the land, avoiding steep grades by taking longer, more gradual routes. In other areas, the roads appear to take more direct routes, even over moderately challenging terrain, suggesting that the transport teams were capable of handling slopes and uneven ground. The distribution of fallen roadside moai along these roads is itself informative. Fallen statues are found at various points along the routes, but they tend to cluster at certain locations, typically at points where the road traverses difficult terrain, such as steep slopes, curves, or rough ground. This clustering suggests that these were problem spots, places where the transport method, whatever it was most likely to fail. The orientation and position of the fallen statues, most lying face down, with their heads pointing generally away from the quarry, as if they had been moving forward when they fell, provides additional clues about the direction and mode of transport. A particularly interesting recent study analyzed the size distribution of the roadside moai and compared it to the size distribution of the statues successfully erected on Oahu. The analysis revealed that the roadside moai tend to be slightly larger, on average, than the Oahu moai. This suggests that larger statues were more likely to fail during transport, an intuitive finding that confirms the basic physical challenges involved and suggests that the transport method, whatever it was, had a size limit beyond which the risk of failure became unacceptably high. This may explain why the very largest moai, those above a certain weight and height, were disproportionately likely to be found abandoned at the quarry or along the roads rather than standing on Oahu. The Oahu platforms themselves have been the subject of extensive archaeological investigation, and our understanding of their construction, chronology, and function has advanced considerably in recent decades. One of the most important findings is that many Oahu were not built from scratch but were constructed in phases, with earlier, simpler structures being enlarged, modified, and rebuilt over time. Some Oahu show evidence of multiple construction phases spanning several centuries, with each phase adding new elements, additional moai, expanded platforms, new wings, or plazas. This phased construction pattern suggests that Oahu were not built in a single burst of activity, but were ongoing projects, added to and modified over the life of the community, each generation contributing new elements to the ancestral complex. Some Oahu also show evidence of having been deliberately modified during the transition from the Moai period to the Birdman Cult period. In some cases, the platform was dismantled and rebuilt using the same stones, but in a different configuration, the Moai removed or toppled, the platform structure altered, and sometimes the burial chambers expanded or the orientation changed. These modifications tell us that the Oahu, like the Moai, were not merely abandoned during the cultural transition, but were actively repurposed, their meaning and function reinterpreted within the new cultural framework. The construction techniques used for the Oahu are themselves impressive. The best-built Oahu display a level of stone working skill that rivals anything found in Polynesia and compares favorably to the finest megalithic construction anywhere in the world. The platform walls are built from large, carefully shaped blocks of basalt, fitted together without mortar in precise interlocking patterns. The joints between blocks are tight, in some cases, barely a knife blade can be inserted between them. The blocks are not merely stacked but shaped to fit together, with interlocking faces that provide structural stability. This precision stone fitting technique, sometimes called ashlar masonry, requires considerable skill and patience. Each block must be individually shaped to fit its neighbors, a process that involves repeated trial fittings, chipping, and grinding. The fact that the Rapa Nui achieved this level of precision using only stone tools makes their masonry even more remarkable. The finest example of Rapa Nui stone working is found at Ahu Vinapu, a site on the island's south coast. The rear wall of Ahu Vinapu No. 1 displays such precise, tight-fitting stonework that early visitors compared it to the famous Inca walls of Cusco and Sacsayhuaman in Peru. This comparison sparked considerable speculation about possible contact between Rapa Nui and South America, a theory most notably championed by Thor Heyerdahl, who argued that the original settlers of Easter Island came from South America rather than Polynesia. Heyerdahl famously sailed the balsa wood raft Kon-Tiki from Peru to Polynesia in 1947 to demonstrate that such a voyage was possible. The South American connection theory has been largely rejected by mainstream archaeology. The linguistic, genetic, and material culture evidence overwhelmingly supports a Polynesian origin for the Rapa Nui people. However, and this is a fascinating footnote, recent genetic studies have identified a small but statistically significant South American genetic component in the Rapa Nui population, suggesting that some contact between Easter Island and South America did occur, probably in the pre-European period. The most likely scenario is that Polynesian voyagers from Rapa Nui reached the coast of South America, or that South American voyagers reached Rapa Nui, and that a limited exchange of people and perhaps of ideas, including agricultural techniques and possibly even the sweet potato, which is of South American origin, took place. But this contact, whatever its nature, was limited and does not change the fundamental picture. The Rapa Nui civilization was Polynesian in origin, character, and development. The question of how the Pukao, the red scoria Topknots, were placed on top of the already erected Moai is another aspect of the transport and erection puzzle that has received recent attention. The Pukao were carved at Pukao, a small volcanic crater about 6 miles from Raraku and varying distances from the various Ahu sites. They are cylindrical or slightly tapered in shape, typically 5 to 6 feet in diameter and several feet tall, and they weigh between 2 and 12 tons. Getting a multi-ton cylinder of stone to the top of a 30-foot statue is not a trivial engineering problem. Several methods have been proposed. One suggestion is that the Pukao were raised using some kind of ramp, perhaps a temporary earthen ramp built alongside the Ahu that allowed the Pukao to be rolled or dragged up to the level of the statue's head. Another suggestion is that the Pukao were levered up incrementally, using a parbuckling technique in which ropes are wrapped around the Pukao and used to roll it up an inclined surface. A study published in 2018 by a team led by Sean Hickson of Penn State University proposed an elegant solution based on engineering analysis and the physical properties of the Pukao themselves. The researchers used three-dimensional digital models of Pukao and photo-based scanning of the Pukao at Pukao to analyze their shape, weight distribution, and potential transport methods. They concluded that the Pukao were most likely rolled to the Ahu sites, their cylindrical shape making rolling the most efficient transport method, and then tipped upright and walked up a ramp using the same kind of rocking and rolling technique proposed for the Moai themselves. Once at the top of the ramp and at the level of the statue's head, the Pukao could be tipped from its vertical position onto the flat top of the Moai. This is another example of the kind of clever, practical engineering that characterized Rapa Nui construction methods, using the physical shape of the object itself to facilitate transport and placement, rather than relying on brute force or complex machinery. The erection of the Moai on the Ahu platform is yet another engineering challenge that has been studied and debated. Once transported to the Ahu site, the Moai had to be raised from whatever position it was in, whether lying on its face, lying on its back, or standing upright if it had been walked to a vertical position on the platform. Several methods have been proposed for this final raising. Heyerdahl's 1955 expedition included an experiment in which a team of islanders raised a medium-sized Moai onto an Ahu using a simple levering technique. The statue was gradually levered upward using long wooden poles as levers and small stones packed beneath it as it was raised, building up a supporting pile of stones increment by increment until the statue reached a vertical position and could be slid onto the platform. The process was slow and labor-intensive but effective, and it demonstrated that the raising could be accomplished without cranes or pulleys. Other proposed methods involve earthen ramps, temporary scaffolding of logs and stones, or some combination of levering and ramping. The specific method likely varied depending on the size of the moai, the configuration of the ahu, and the available labor and materials. What is clear is that the Rapa Nui developed effective techniques for this final, critical step, the moment when the ancestor was raised to his feet and set to watch over the land. And then the eyes were set. The white coral eyes with their dark pupils were placed in the sockets, and the moai opened its eyes for the first time. The mana flowed, the ancestor was alive. We can imagine the ceremony that must have accompanied this moment. We can imagine the chanting, the prayers, the feast. We can imagine the pride of the clan that had conceived, commissioned, carved, transported, and erected this enormous stone ancestor. We can imagine the awe of the onlookers, the children seeing a new moai open its eyes for the first time, the elders remembering the years of labor that had led to this moment, the chief standing before his people and his ancestors, the embodiment of a lineage of mana stretching back to the founders. We can imagine it, but we cannot know it fully, because the ceremonies, the prayers, the specific rituals, these have been largely lost, casualties of the demographic catastrophe of the 19th century and the suppression of traditional culture that followed. What remains are fragments, bits and pieces preserved in oral tradition, in the accounts of early European observers in the archaeological record. We piece them together as best we can, knowing that the picture will always be incomplete. This is one of the great sadnesses of the Easter Island story. Not just the toppling of the statues, not just the deforestation, not just the social upheaval, but the loss of knowledge. The loss of the words, the songs, the stories, the prayers that gave meaning to the stones. The moai still stand, some of them restored, but the voices that once spoke to them, the eyes that once looked upon them with understanding, the hearts that once swelled with pride and reverence at their sight, those are mostly gone. We see the statues, but we hear only echoes, and yet the Rapa Nui endure. Their descendants live on the island today, their language is spoken, their dances are danced, their stories, though fragmented, are told. And the moai, those magnificent, haunting, impossible stone giants, still stand, still watching, still waiting. The quarry at Rano, Raraku, still holds its unfinished statues, frozen in the act of emerging from the mountain. The roads still trace their paths across the landscape, marked by fallen giants that never reached their destinations. The ahu still line the coast, some restored, some in ruins, all bearing witness to a civilization that dreamed of giants and made those dreams real. There is so much more to tell. The details of the Birdman Cult and its elaborate ceremonies at Orongo, the mystery of the Rongorongo script and the efforts to decode it. The complex ecology of the island's crater lakes and what they reveal about environmental change. The recent genetic studies that have illuminated the island's population history. The ongoing debates about chronology, population size, and the causes and consequences of cultural change. The political struggles of the modern Rapa Nui people for sovereignty and self-determination. The challenges of conservation and management at one of the world's most iconic and vulnerable archaeological sites. These stories continue in the second part of this documentary, where we will delve deeper into the mysteries that remain unsolved, the discoveries that are still being made, and the enduring legacy of the moai, the stone giants who walked across a tiny island at the edge of the world and captured the imagination of all humanity. For now, let us leave the moai where they stand on their ahu platforms along the coast, their great stone faces turned inland, their blind eyes gazing across the green and brown landscape of their island. The wind blows across them as it has for centuries, carrying the salt spray of the Pacific, the faint cries of seabirds, the distant sound of waves breaking on the volcanic shore. They were carved by human hands, they were moved by human ingenuity, they were raised by human faith, and they endure. They endure as monuments to the power of human ambition, the depth of human spirituality, and the boundless capacity of the human mind to conceive of the impossible, and then, through determination, skill, and the sheer force of collective will, to make it real. The moai of Rapa Nui are among the most extraordinary things that human beings have ever created. They stand as proof carved in stone, weighing tons, standing 30 feet tall, that there is no limit to what people can achieve when they believe in something greater than themselves. They walked from the mountain. They walk still in our imagination, in our wonder, in our ceaseless quest to understand who we are and what we are capable of. The giants walked, and that is only the beginning of the story. On a small island lost in the immensity of the Pacific Ocean, nearly 1,000 stone giants once stood watch over a civilization that the rest of the world did not know existed. They were carved from a volcanic mountain by people who had no metal, no wheels, no written engineering plans. They were moved miles across rugged terrain by methods so ingenious that for centuries, no outsider could believe it had been done by human hands alone. And then, one by one, they were pulled down, toppled from their platforms, their great stone faces pressed into the earth, their coral eyes shattered and scattered, their mana silenced. But the story did not end there. It never ends there, because the Moai of Rapa Nui are not relics of a dead civilization. They are the living heritage of a living people. And the mysteries they hold, mysteries of language, of astronomy, of engineering, of ecology, of the human spirit itself, continue to unfold, decade by decade, discovery by discovery, as researchers and the Rapa Nui people themselves work to understand what was built on this island, what was lost, and what can still be recovered. In the first part of this documentary, we traced the broad arc of the Moai story, from the arrival of the first Polynesian settlers on a forested, fertile island, through the golden age of statue construction, to the environmental and social transformations that brought the era of the Moai to an end. We explored the quarry at Rano, Raraku, the methods of carving and transport, the function of the ahu platforms, and the spiritual significance of the statues as vessels of ancestral mana. Now we go deeper into the details, into the mysteries that remain unsolved, into the discoveries that are rewriting what we thought we knew, into the world behind the stone faces, the ceremonies, the writing, the astronomy, the politics, the ecology, and the enduring human drama of Rapa Nui. Let us begin with the thing that makes Easter Island unique not just among Polynesian islands, not just among Pacific civilizations, but among all pre-modern societies on Earth: Rongorongo. The word itself has a musical quality, Rongorongo, and it refers to one of the most enigmatic and tantalizing objects in the entire history of human communication. Rongorongo is a system of glyphs, carved or incised into wooden tablets, staffs, and other objects, that was found on Easter Island and that has never been deciphered. It may be, and this is a statement that must be made carefully, with appropriate scholarly caution, one of a very small number of independent inventions of writing in all of human history. The significance of that claim cannot be overstated. The invention of writing is one of the rarest and most consequential achievements of human civilization. Most writing systems in the world today can trace their ancestry back to a handful of original inventions: Sumerian cuneiform in Mesopotamia, Egyptian hieroglyphics in the Nile Valley, Chinese characters in East Asia, and the Mesoamerican scripts of the Maya and their predecessors. Some scholars add the Indus Valley script, though its status as true writing remains debated, and the Cretan scripts of the Aegean Bronze Age. If Rongorongo is indeed an independent invention, if it was created by the Rapa Nui without knowledge of or influence from any other writing system, then it represents one of perhaps 5 or 6 times in all of human history that human beings independently conceived the idea of encoding language in visual symbols. On a tiny, isolated island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no contact with any literate civilization. That is extraordinary. But the word "if" is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and we must be honest about what we know and what we do not know about Rongorongo. What we know is this: when European missionaries arrived on Easter Island in the 1860s, they found that the islanders possessed wooden tablets and other objects inscribed with rows of small, intricate glyphs. The glyphs depicted stylized human figures, birds, fish, plants, geometric shapes, and other symbols, arranged in neat horizontal lines. The writing direction was unusual boustrophedon, meaning that alternate lines run in opposite directions, with the glyphs in every other line appearing upside down relative to the line above. To read the text, one would read a line from left to right, then rotate the tablet 180 degrees and read the next line, again from left to right, then rotate again, and so on. This distinctive writing direction, while not unknown in other ancient writing systems, is relatively rare and adds to the difficulty of decipherment. The missionaries, being missionaries, were not primarily interested in the Rongorongo tablets as objects of scholarly study. They were interested in converting the Rapa Nui to Christianity, and they viewed the tablets, which were associated with the old pagan religious system, with suspicion or hostility. Some tablets were destroyed, others were collected and sent to museums in Europe and South America. And critically, the missionaries did not make systematic efforts to record what the tablets said, who could read them, or how the reading system worked. By the time scholars became interested in Rongorongo, it was too late. The slave raids of 1862 had killed or removed most of the island's literate elite, the priests, chiefs, and specialists who had been trained to read and recite the tablets. The smallpox epidemic that followed killed more. By the time the first serious attempts at decipherment were made, in the 1870s and 1880s, there was almost no one left on the island who could read Rongorongo. A few elderly individuals claimed partial knowledge, but their accounts were fragmentary, inconsistent, and difficult to verify. The result is that today, approximately 150 years after the last fluent readers of Rongorongo died, we possess only 26 objects bearing Rongorongo inscriptions, scattered across museums and private collections around the world, and no reliable key to their meaning. The texts remain undeciphered. This has not stopped people from trying. Rongorongo has attracted a steady stream of researchers, amateur enthusiasts, and outright cranks since the late 19th century. Dozens of proposed decipherments have been published, none of which has gained general acceptance in the scholarly community. The fundamental problem is the small size of the corpus, 26 objects, containing a total of roughly 14,000 glyphs, and the absence of any bilingual text or known context that could serve as a Rosetta Stone. However, significant progress has been made in understanding the structure of the script, even without deciphering the content. Researchers have identified approximately 120 basic glyph elements, which can be combined in various ways to produce a larger inventory of compound glyphs. Statistical analysis of glyph frequencies and sequences has revealed patterns that are consistent with a linguistic writing system. That is, the patterns suggest that Rongorongo encodes language, rather than being purely pictographic, decorative, or mnemonic. Some researchers have identified what appear to be repeating formulas or phrases, suggesting that the tablets may contain ritual chants, genealogies, or calendrical records, the kinds of texts that would be expected in a Polynesian religious context. One of the most intriguing findings involves what has been called the lunar calendar hypothesis. In 1958, the German ethnologist Thomas Barthel proposed that one particular Rongorongo text, known as Tablet Mammary, contains a lunar calendar, with glyphs representing the phases of the moon arranged in a sequence that corresponds to the Polynesian lunar month. This hypothesis has been debated but not definitively confirmed or refuted, and it remains one of the most promising leads in Rongorongo research. More recently, in the 21st century, researchers have applied computational methods, including machine learning and artificial intelligence, to the analysis of Rongorongo. These methods have identified statistical regularities in the glyph sequences that were not apparent through manual analysis, and they have suggested possible structural features of the writing system that may eventually aid decipherment. A study published in 2023 by a team of researchers used sophisticated computational techniques to analyze the internal structure of the Rongorongo corpus, and concluded that the script shows characteristics consistent with a logographic or logosyllabic writing system, a system in which individual glyphs represent words or syllables, similar in principle to Chinese characters or Mayan hieroglyphics. But even with these advances, a full decipherment remains elusive. The corpus is simply too small, and the lack of any external reference point any bilingual text, any known proper name, any identifiable historical event mentioned in the texts makes it extremely difficult to break into the system. The decipherment of Rongorongo, if it ever comes, will likely require either a lucky discovery, a new tablet, a new inscription, an overlooked document containing a partial translation, or a breakthrough in computational methods that can extract meaning from the statistical patterns in the existing texts. What is certain is that Rongorongo was deeply important to the Rapa Nui. The tablets were sacred objects associated with the priestly class and the religious ceremonies of the old culture. They were not casual documents, not shopping lists or personal letters, but ritual texts imbued with mana and handled only by those authorized to do so. The oral traditions of the Rapa Nui describe the tablets as being recited aloud during ceremonies, with the reader chanting the text while holding the tablet and turning it according to the Undeciphered reading direction. The word Rongorongo itself is sometimes translated as chants or recitations, reinforcing the connection between the script and oral performance. The question of whether Rongorongo was an independent invention or was inspired by contact with European writing remains debated. Some scholars have noted that the earliest firm evidence for Rongorongo dates to the late 18th or early 19th century, after European contact, and have suggested that the Rapa Nui may have been inspired by the sight of European written documents, particularly the written treaty that the Spanish explorer González de Ejido presented to Rapa Nui chiefs in 1770. According to this hypothesis, the Rapa Nui, impressed by the power of European writing, created their own script in imitation. However, other scholars argue that the complexity and uniqueness of Rongorongo, its distinctive glyph inventory, its Undeciphered direction, its apparent encoding of Rapa Nui language, suggest a longer period of development than could have occurred in the few decades between European contact and the first known Rongorongo objects. The question remains open, and it may never be resolved without new evidence. Whether independent invention or inspired creation, Rongorongo stands as a remarkable intellectual achievement of the Rapa Nui people, a writing system developed on one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, encoding a language spoken by a few thousand people, serving a spiritual and ceremonial function that we can only dimly perceive across the centuries of loss and disruption that separate us from its creators. Now let us return to the island itself and examine more closely the transformation that occurred as the age of the Moai gave way to the age of the Birdman. Because this transition, this profound shift in religion, politics, and social organization, is one of the most fascinating and least understood chapters in the history of Rapa Nui. We touched on the Birdman Cult briefly in the first part of this documentary, but the subject deserves much more detailed treatment. The Tangata Manu, the Birdman, was not a minor folk custom or a peripheral ritual. It was, for a period of perhaps 200 years or more, the central organizing institution of Rapa Nui society, replacing the old system of hereditary chieftainship and ancestral Moai worship with a radically different model of political power. The ceremonial center of the Birdman cult was the village of Orongo, and Orongo itself is one of the most dramatic archaeological sites in the Pacific. It is perched on the narrow, knife-edge rim of Rano, a massive volcanic crater on the southwestern tip of the island. To one side of the village, the ground falls away steeply into the crater itself, a vast circular depression nearly a mile across, its floor covered by a lake choked with tatora reeds and floating islands of vegetation. To the other side, the ground drops almost vertically in sheer sea cliffs, plunging 1,000 feet to the churning Pacific surf below. The village occupies the thinnest, most precarious strip of land imaginable, with the crater on one side and the ocean abyss on the other. The village consists of approximately 50 stone houses, built in a distinctive style found nowhere else on the island. They are low, oval structures with thick walls of horizontally laid stone slabs, roofed with similar slabs and partially embedded in the earth. The interiors are small, dark, and cramped, clearly not designed for permanent habitation, but for temporary use during the annual Birdman ceremonies. The doorways are small and low, requiring visitors to crawl in on hands and knees. The walls and rocks around the village are covered with hundreds of petroglyphs, carved images of the Birdman figure, a distinctive half-human, half-bird creature with a human body and a bird's head, holding an egg. The Birdman petroglyphs are found in extraordinary concentration at Orongo, as well as at other sites around the island, and they represent one of the most recognizable artistic motifs of Rapa Nui culture. The Birdman ceremony itself was an annual event tied to the arrival of the sooty tern, known in Rapa Nui as the Manutara. The sooty tern is a migratory seabird that returns each spring to breed on the small offshore islets visible from the cliffs of Orongo, Matu Nui, Matu Iti, and Matu Kau. These islets are jagged, wave-battered volcanic rocks, barely large enough to support nesting colonies, separated from the main island by a channel of rough, cold, shark-infested water. Each year, the chiefs or leaders of the competing clans would gather at Orongo and nominate a representative, a hapumanu, or bird servant, to compete on their behalf. At the appointed time, the hapu would descend the terrifying cliffs of Rano, a nearly vertical descent of several hundred meters over crumbling, wind-blasted rock, reach the water at the base, and swim approximately a mile through heavy surf and dangerous currents to Matu Nui. There they would wait, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, living in caves on the tiny islet, exposed to wind and rain, surviving on whatever food and water they had brought or could scavenge, watching the sky for the first sooty terns to arrive. When the birds finally came and began nesting, the race began in earnest. The hapu searched frantically for the first egg. The first man to find one had to secure it, either in a small reed container or strapped to his forehead with a band of bark cloth, and then make the return journey, swimming back through the surf to the base of the cliffs, climbing the cliffs, and delivering the egg intact to his sponsor waiting at Orongo. The dangers were very real. The swim was treacherous. Sharks patrolled the channel. The currents were strong and unpredictable. The cliffs were nearly vertical and subject to rockfall. Men died in the competition, drowned, fallen, taken by sharks. The historical and oral record contains accounts of hapu who perished in the attempt, their sponsors left without a representative, their clans without hope of winning the Birdman title that year. But for the winner, for the hapu who delivered the first egg, the reward was transformative. His sponsor was declared the Tangata Manu, the Birdman, for the coming year. The new Birdman shaved his head, painted his scalp red, and withdrew to a special house, sometimes described as a sacred seclusion, for a period of months. During this time, the Birdman was considered tapu, sacred, set apart, imbued with tremendous mana. His clan gained significant political and economic privileges, including, according to some accounts, the right to collect resources from other clans' territories, a form of tribute that conferred real material advantage. The Birdman system was fundamentally different from the old chiefly system in several important ways. First, it was competitive rather than hereditary. Under the old system, the Erection, the paramount chief, held power by virtue of his genealogy, his descent from the founding ancestor Hatumata. This was fixed, unchangeable. Under the Birdman system, power was won annually through a combination of physical prowess, luck, and the ability to recruit and support an effective hapu. Any clan could potentially win. Power rotated. No single lineage had a permanent lock on authority. Second, the Birdman system shifted the basis of sacred power from the ancestral Moai to a different source, the Manutara, the sooty tern, and the egg that symbolized fertility, renewal, and the annual return of abundance. The mana of the Tangata Manu came not from stone ancestors but from a living bird, a creature that arrived each year from beyond the horizon, from the unknown world beyond the sea, bringing with it the promise of new life. Third, the Birdman system was associated with a different deity, Make, the creator god, who was believed to be the supreme deity in the later Rapa Nui religious system. Make was not one of the deified ancestors represented by the Moai, but a separate, higher-order deity associated with fertility, creation, and the Birdman cult. His image, a round-eyed, sometimes skull-like face, appears frequently in the petroglyphs at Orongo and at other sites associated with the Birdman cult. The transition from the Moai system to the Birdman system was not necessarily smooth or peaceful. Some scholars believe that it was accompanied by significant social conflict, warfare between clans, disruption of the old social order, violence against the symbols and practitioners of the old religion. The toppling of the Moai, which occurred during roughly the same period, can be seen as part of this broader process of social transformation, a deliberate repudiation of the old ancestral worship system and an assertion of the new Birdman ideology. Others, however, caution against reading the transition as a simple revolution or collapse. They point out that elements of the old and new systems coexisted for a considerable period, and that the Birdman cult may have emerged gradually, building on existing religious practices rather than replacing them wholesale. The Birdman motif, for example, appears in Rapa Nui art from a relatively early period, suggesting that the concepts underlying the cult had deep roots in the island's culture. The Birdman cult continued as the central institution of Rapa Nui society until the arrival of Christian missionaries in the 1860s. The last known Birdman competition took place in approximately 1866 or 1867, after which the ceremony was suppressed by the missionaries as part of their campaign to eradicate traditional religion. The stone houses of Orongo were partially dismantled, some of the petroglyphs were damaged, and the Birdman tradition was driven underground, surviving only in the memories and oral traditions of the elders. Today, Orongo has been partially restored and is a protected archaeological site visited by thousands of tourists each year. The petroglyphs of the Birdman figure, that haunting half-human, half-bird image, crouching with an egg in its hand, have become one of the iconic symbols of Rapa Nui, as recognizable in their way as the Moai themselves. Let us now turn our attention to the environmental history of the island in greater detail, because the ecology of Rapa Nui is not merely a backdrop to the human story, it is an integral part of it. The relationship between the Rapa Nui people and their environment was intimate, complex, and consequential, and understanding that relationship is essential to understanding both the rise and the transformation of Rapa Nui civilization. The primary source of evidence for the island's environmental history is the sediment cores taken from the crater lakes of Rano Raraku, Rano Kau, and Rano Are, the three volcanic craters on the island that contain bodies of fresh water. These crater lakes have accumulated layers of sediment over thousands of years, and those sediment layers contain a wealth of information: pollen grains, charcoal particles, phytoliths, microscopic silica structures from plants, chemical signatures, and microfossils that allow scientists to reconstruct the island's vegetation, climate, and human impact over time. The pollen record tells a clear story. For thousands of years before human arrival, the island was dominated by the giant palm Pachylococos disperta, now extinct, along with a diverse assemblage of other tree and shrub species. The palm pollen is abundant in the pre-human sediment layers, and it disappears sharply after the arrival of the first settlers. The decline is not instantaneous. It occurs over a period of several centuries, but it is dramatic and unmistakable. By approximately 1400 to 1500, the palm pollen has virtually disappeared from the record, indicating that the giant palm was effectively extinct on the island. The charcoal record tells a complementary story. Charcoal particles in the sediment cores increase sharply after human arrival, indicating widespread burning, presumably for agricultural clearing. The burning is concentrated in the early centuries of settlement, when the forest was being actively cleared to make way for gardens and fields. As the forest diminished, the amount of charcoal in the sediment also declines. There was simply less forest left to burn. The disappearance of the forest had cascading ecological consequences. Without tree cover, the soil was exposed to wind and rain erosion. nutrient cycling was disrupted. The island's hydrology changed. Without tree roots to absorb and retain water, rainfall ran off more quickly, reducing the availability of fresh water. The loss of the forest also eliminated habitat for the island's native land birds, several species of which went extinct during the period of human settlement. The impact on the island's seabird populations was equally severe. Rapa Nui, before human arrival, was home to enormous breeding colonies of seabirds, possibly the largest and most diverse seabird rookery in the eastern Pacific. At least 25 species of seabird are known to have bred on the island or its offshore islets, including petrels, shearwaters, tropic birds, terns, boobies, and frigate birds. The bones of these birds are abundant in the earliest archaeological layers, indicating that seabirds were an important food source for the first settlers. But over time, the seabird populations declined drastically. Habitat loss, predation by the Polynesian rat, collection of eggs and chicks for food, and disturbance of nesting sites all contributed to the decline. By the time of European contact, most of the seabird species had been extirpated from the main island, surviving only on the offshore islets, including the very islets that became the focus of the Birdman Cult. This is a striking connection, and one that several researchers have explored. The sooty tern, the bird at the center of the Birdman Cult, was among the species that had been driven from the main island but continued to nest on the offshore islets. The annual arrival of the sooty terns on Motu Nui and the competition to obtain the first egg took on heightened significance in a context where seabirds had become scarce and their return was no longer guaranteed. The Birdman Cult in this reading was not just a political institution but an ecological one, a ritual response to the decline of a critical resource, a way of marking, celebrating, and perhaps magically ensuring the annual return of the birds and the fertility they represented. The marine environment also changed over the centuries of Rapa Nui occupation, though the changes were less dramatic than those on land. The loss of large timber meant that the Rapa Nui could no longer build the large, ocean-going canoes that had been essential for deep-sea fishing. Without these canoes, the islanders were increasingly restricted to fishing from the shore or from small, shallow water craft, limiting their access to the open ocean fish species, particularly tuna and dolphin, that had been an important protein source in the earlier period. The archaeological record shows a clear shift in the fish bone assemblage over time, from a mix of deep-sea and inshore species in the early layers to a predominance of inshore species in the later layers. However, and this is an important corrective to the simple collapse narrative, the Rapa Nui did not simply suffer passively as their environment changed. As we discussed in the first part of this documentary, they adapted. They developed lithic mulching and Manavai garden enclosures to maintain agricultural productivity. They shifted their protein sources from fish and seabirds to chickens, which they raised in increasing numbers. They cultivated sweet potatoes, which proved to be a reliable and productive crop even in degraded soils, and they continued to exploit whatever marine resources were available from the shore. Recent archaeological and isotopic studies have shed new light on the diet and nutritional status of the Rapa Nui population over time. Analysis of human skeletal remains, including stable isotope analysis, which can reveal the proportions of different food sources in an individual's diet, suggests that the Rapa Nui maintained a relatively stable and adequate diet throughout most of their pre-contact history, with sweet potatoes providing the bulk of calories and marine foods, and chicken providing protein. There is no clear evidence of widespread malnutrition or famine in the skeletal record, at least not until the post-contact period when European diseases and social disruption took their toll. This finding is significant because it challenges the traditional collapse narrative, which posited widespread starvation as a consequence of environmental degradation. The evidence suggests that the Rapa Nui were more resilient and more adaptable than the collapse narrative gave them credit for. They faced real environmental challenges, deforestation, soil degradation, loss of biodiversity, but they responded with ingenuity and effort, maintaining a viable food supply even as their environment changed around them. The question of inter-clan warfare, another key element of the collapse narrative, has also been revisited by recent research. The traditional story describes a period of intense, violent conflict between the island's clans during the 17th and 18th centuries, with the toppling of rival Moai as a central element of this warfare. And indeed, there is archaeological evidence of conflict. Obsidian spear points called mata are found in large numbers in the later archaeological layers, and there are accounts in the oral traditions of battles between clans. However, recent studies of the mata have raised questions about their interpretation. A detailed morphological analysis published in 2016 by Carl Lipo and his colleagues concluded that the vast majority of mata are not well suited for use as weapons. They are too irregularly shaped, too fragile, and too difficult to haft effectively to function as spearpoints or arrowheads. Instead, the researchers argued most mata were more likely used as tools for cutting, scraping, tattooing, or other domestic and ritual purposes. This does not mean that no conflict occurred. The oral traditions of warfare are too consistent and detailed to be dismissed, but it suggests that the scale and intensity of the violence may have been exaggerated by the collapse narrative. Similarly, the claim that the Rapa Nui practiced widespread cannibalism, a claim that has been a fixture of the popular Easter Island story for more than a century, is supported by very little solid evidence. The cannibalism claim appears to derive primarily from oral accounts collected by European missionaries and ethnographers in the 19th century, but these accounts are difficult to evaluate. They were collected from a traumatized and decimated population by collectors who may have had their own biases and agendas, and they may reflect post-contact social disruption rather than pre-contact norms. Some skeletal evidence has been cited in support of cannibalism, but the evidence is ambiguous and subject to alternative interpretations. None of this is to say that Rapa Nui history was peaceful and idyllic. It was not. Real challenges, real conflicts, and real suffering occurred. But the picture that is emerging from recent research is more complex and more balanced than the dramatic tale of ecological catastrophe and civilizational collapse that has dominated popular understanding of Easter Island for decades. Let us now explore some of the specific Moai sites around the island in greater detail, because each ahu and its Moai has its own story, its own history, its own character, and together they paint a rich picture of the diversity and dynamism of Rapa Nui civilization. We begin with Ahu Tongariki, the largest and most impressive ahu on the island. Located on the southeastern coast, just a short distance from the quarry at Rano, Raraku, Ahu Tongariki supports 15 Moai standing in a row on a massive platform that stretches more than 700 feet in length. The statues vary in size, with the tallest standing approximately 30 feet high. They are a magnificent sight, 15 stone giants standing shoulder to shoulder against the sky, facing inland, their great faces catching the light of the rising sun each morning. But Ahu Tongariki has had a turbulent history. Like all the ahu on the island, its Moai were toppled during the period of cultural upheaval, and they lay face down in the dirt for more than a century. Then in 1960, the catastrophic Chilean earthquake, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded, measuring 9.5 on the Richter scale, generated a massive tsunami that struck Easter Island's coast. At Ahu Tongariki, the tsunami swept the already toppled Moai inland, scattering them across the landscape like enormous stone bowling pins. Some were carried more than 300 feet from the platform. The ahu itself was severely damaged, its carefully fitted stones disarranged and displaced. The restoration of Ahu Tongariki is one of the great stories of modern archaeology and international cooperation. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a major restoration project was undertaken, funded in part by a contribution from a Japanese corporation and led by Chilean archaeologist Claudio Cristino. A massive crane, the only way to lift the 80-ton statues, was shipped to the island, and over a period of several years, the ahu was rebuilt and the 15 moai were re-erected. The restored ahu Tongariki was inaugurated in 1995, and it has since become the most photographed and most visited site on the island. The restoration was not without controversy. Some archaeologists argued that re-erecting the moai altered the archaeological record and created a misleading impression of the site's original appearance. Others countered that the restoration was culturally and spiritually important to the Rapa Nui people, who wished to see their ancestors standing once again. The debate reflects a broader tension in archaeology and heritage management between the scientific imperative to preserve sites in their existing condition and the cultural imperative to restore and revitalize sites that hold deep meaning for living communities. From Ahu Tongariki, let us travel along the coast to Anakna on the island's northern shore. Anakna is a small, sheltered beach, one of only 2 sandy beaches on the island, and it holds a special place in Rapa Nui tradition as the landing site of Hatu Mata'a, the legendary founder and first king. According to oral tradition, it was here that Hatu Mata'a and his people first came ashore after their long ocean voyage, and it was here that the first settlement was established. Anakna is home to 2 restored ahu, Ahu Nau Nau and Ahu Acherhuki. Ahu Nau Nau supports 7 moai, several of which are in excellent condition, with detailed carvings on their backs that are among the best preserved on the island. It was during the restoration of Ahu Nau Nau in 1978, led by the Rapa Nui archaeologist Sergio Rapuhea, that the famous coral eye was discovered, the first definitive evidence that the moai had originally been designed with inlaid eyes. The discovery of the eye was a revelation, transforming our understanding of the statue's appearance and their spiritual function. The blank, eyeless moai that we are accustomed to seeing are, in a sense, incomplete. They are ancestors with their eyes closed, their mana dormant. The original moai, with their coral eyes open and staring, must have been profoundly different, more vivid, more intense, more alive. Ahu Acherhuki, also at Anakna, is historically significant as the site where Thor Heyerdahl conducted his famous moai raising experiment in 1955. It was here that a team of Rapa Nui Islanders demonstrated that a moai could be raised from a horizontal to a vertical position using wooden levers and a gradual buildup of supporting stones. The statue that was raised in that experiment, a single, relatively small moai, still stands on its ahu at Anakna today. Moving along the north coast, we come to Ahu Tipito Cura, the site of the largest moai ever successfully erected. This is Paro, the giant of giants, standing approximately 33 feet tall with an estimated weight of 82 tons. Paro's Pukao, its red scoria topknot, weighs an additional 11 tons and was the largest Pukao ever placed on a moai. Today, Paro lies toppled and broken in front of its ahu, one of the most poignant sights on the island, the greatest of all the moai, brought low. Near Ahu Tipito Cura lies a large, smooth, rounded boulder known as Tipito o Tihenua, the navel of the world, which is said in local tradition to have been brought to the island by Hatu Mata'a himself. The stone is surrounded by 4 smaller stones and is the focus of a tradition that it possesses mana and can be felt to emit warmth or energy when touched. Whether or not one believes in the stone's supernatural properties, it is a powerful symbol of the Rapa Nui belief that their island was the center of the world, the place from which all existence radiated outward. On the western coast stands Ahu Akivi, the site of the only moai that face the sea. 7 statues stand in a row on an inland platform, their faces turned toward the ocean, or more precisely, toward the point on the horizon where the sun sets during the equinox. Ahu Akivi was restored in 1960 by the American archaeologist William Moai, who spent decades working on Easter Island and whose contributions to our understanding of the island's archaeology were immense. Moai proposed that Ahu Akivi had astronomical significance, its alignment with the equinox sunset suggesting that the Rapa Nui possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and incorporated it into the design and placement of their monuments. The astronomical dimensions of Rapa Nui culture have attracted considerable scholarly attention. Several ahu appear to be aligned with significant astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, and the rising or setting points of particular stars. The Rapa Nui, like other Polynesian peoples, were skilled observers of the sky, and their navigational heritage would have given them a deep familiarity with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. It would be surprising if this knowledge were not reflected in the orientation and design of their most important monuments. However, claims about the astronomical significance of specific ahu must be evaluated cautiously. With dozens of ahu distributed around the coastline, oriented in various directions, it is statistically inevitable that some of them will align with some astronomical events by chance alone. Establishing deliberate astronomical intent requires more than simple alignment. It requires a pattern, a consistency, or corroborating evidence from the cultural record. Researchers continue to investigate these questions, and the evidence, while suggestive, remains incomplete. Let us now return to the Moai themselves and explore some of the less well-known aspects of their design, manufacture, and meaning. One fascinating feature of many Moai that is often overlooked by casual observers is the presence of detailed carvings on the backs and buttocks of the statues. These carvings, which are best preserved on statues that were buried or otherwise protected from weathering, include depictions of what appear to be ceremonial belts, loincloths, and rings or circles that may represent the sun, vulvas, or other symbolic elements. Some statues have elaborate designs carved across the entire back surface, including spirals, crescents, and what appear to be representations of the marrow, a ceremonial loincloth associated with chiefly authority. The presence of these back carvings tells us several things. First, it tells us that the Moai were not merely giant heads, they were full figures, and the details of their bodies were important. The carvings on the backs were not visible from the front, where the public viewing position would have been, but they were there, part of the complete identity of the ancestor being represented. This suggests that the carvings had ritual or spiritual significance beyond their visual impact. Second, the back carvings tell us something about the finishing process. The detailed carvings on some of the buried statues at Rano, Raraku, suggest that at least some finishing work was done, while the statues were standing in the quarry's staging area before transport. This contradicts the assumption that statues were roughed out at the quarry and finished at their final ahu locations. Third, the back carvings have helped researchers trace the stylistic evolution of the Moai over time. The earliest Moai tend to have simpler, less elaborate back carvings, while later statues show more complex and detailed designs. This stylistic progression provides a relative chronology for the statues and helps to correlate the Moai sequence with other archaeological evidence. Another feature of the Moai that has received increased attention in recent years is the variation in their stone material. While approximately 95% of the Moai were carved from the tuff of Rano, Raraku, a small number were carved from other materials, basalt, red scoria, and a rare, dense volcanic rock called trachyte. These non-standard Moai tend to be among the oldest on the island, and their existence suggests that the early carvers experimented with different materials before settling on the Rano, Raraku tuff as the preferred medium. The concentration on Rano, Raraku tuff for the later, larger statues was probably a practical decision. The tuff is relatively soft and easy to carve, available in large, homogeneous blocks, and located at a single, centralized quarry that could be efficiently managed and controlled. The centralization of Moai production at Rano, Raraku is itself significant. It means that all the clans on the island, regardless of their territorial location, had to come to the same quarry to obtain their statues. This created a situation in which the quarry was a shared resource used by competing groups, and the management of access to the quarry must have required some form of inter-clan negotiation, agreement, or authority. Some researchers have suggested that the Archaeology, the paramount chief, may have controlled access to the quarry, allocating quarrying rights to individual clans as a function of his political authority. Others have proposed a more decentralized model, in which individual clans negotiated directly with each other for quarry access. The distribution of completed moai around the island provides some evidence for how the quarry's output was allocated. Some ahu close to the quarry received more and larger moai than those far away, which could reflect either the difficulty of long-distance transport or the political advantage of clans whose territories were near the quarry. But the pattern is not perfectly correlated with distance. Some distant ahu received large and impressive moai, suggesting that factors other than proximity, such as the wealth, power, or determination of the sponsoring clan, also played a role. Recent geochemical studies have added a new dimension to our understanding of moai distribution. By analyzing the chemical composition of individual moai and matching them to specific locations within the Raraku quarry, researchers have been able to determine where on the quarry slopes each statue was carved. This has revealed patterns in the quarrying process. Certain sections of the quarry were used more intensively than others, and some sections may have been associated with specific clans or time periods. These geochemical fingerprints also allow researchers to confirm that specific moai found at distant ahu sites were indeed quarried at Raraku, ruling out the possibility that some statues were carved from local stone at their destination sites. One of the most significant geochemical studies, published in 2019 by a team including Dale Simpson and Joanne Van Tilburg, analyzed the chemical composition of tools found at various ahu sites around the island and compared them to the composition of basalt sources on the island. The study found that tools at ahu sites often came from basalt sources located far from the ahu, and that tools from different sources were mixed together at individual sites. This pattern suggests extensive inter-clan trade and exchange of materials, a picture of economic interconnection and cooperation that contrasts with the image of isolated, warring clans that dominates the collapse narrative. This finding has broader implications for our understanding of Rapa Nui society. If the clans were engaging in regular trade and exchange of raw materials, this suggests a level of economic integration and social cooperation that goes beyond what the simple collapse narrative would predict. It suggests that the Rapa Nui were not merely competing with each other through moai construction, but were also cooperating, sharing resources, exchanging goods, and maintaining economic relationships that knit the island's communities together. Let us now consider the role of the moai in the broader context of Polynesian culture, because the Rapa Nui were not creating their civilization in a vacuum. They were part of a vast Polynesian cultural tradition that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, and many elements of Rapa Nui culture, including the moai themselves, have parallels and antecedents in other Polynesian societies. The concept of the stone ancestral figure is not unique to Easter Island. Throughout Polynesia, stone and wood figures representing ancestors and deities were created, venerated, and imbued with mana. The tiki figures of the Marquesas Islands, the stone statues of the Austral Islands, the carved god figures of Rarotonga and other Cook Islands, and the monumental stone platforms Mary of the Society Islands, the Marquesas, and New Zealand all reflect a common Polynesian tradition of ancestral worship, monumental architecture, and the creation of sacred spaces where the living could communicate with the spirits of the dead. What makes the Rapa Nui moai extraordinary is not the concept itself, but the scale to which it was taken. Nowhere else in Polynesia, nowhere else in the world, did the tradition of ancestral stone figures produce anything remotely comparable to the moai of Easter Island in terms of size, number, and the labor and engineering required for their creation and transport. The Rapa Nui took a common Polynesian cultural idea and pushed it to an extreme that has no parallel anywhere. Why? Why did the Rapa Nui go so much further than any other Polynesian society in their monument building, Several factors have been proposed. First, isolation. The extreme isolation of Easter Island meant that the Rapa Nui had no contact with other societies, no external trade, and no awareness of other cultural traditions that might have offered alternative forms of expression or competition. All of their creative energy, all of their competitive drive, all of their spiritual aspiration was focused inward, on their own island, their own clans, their own ancestors. There was nowhere else to direct it. The Moai were the focus of a cultural intensity that had no outlet beyond the shores of the island. Second, the availability of suitable stone. The tuff of Raraku is an unusually workable material, soft enough to carve with stone tools, hard enough to endure for centuries once exposed to air, and available in massive quantities at a single location. Not every Polynesian island had access to such ideal carving stone, and the presence of Raraku on Easter Island may have been a necessary precondition for the development of the Moai tradition. Third, inter-clan competition. The division of Rapa Nui into competing clans, each seeking to outdo the others in demonstrations of mana and prestige, created a dynamic of escalation. Each new Moai had to be bigger, more impressive, more ambitious than its predecessors. This competitive dynamic, in the absence of external constraints or competing outlets, drove the production of statues to ever greater extremes. Fourth, and this is perhaps the most speculative factor, but also the most human, there is the sheer creative spirit of the Rapa Nui people. Some cultures produce great poetry, some produce great music, some produce great architecture. The Rapa Nui produced Moai. It was their art form, their medium of cultural expression, their way of saying to the world or to themselves, since they knew no other world, here we are, this is who we are, this is what we can do. The Moai were acts of creation in the deepest sense, expressions of a people's identity, ambition, and faith. They were not built by a culture in decline. They were built by a culture at the height of its creative powers, pouring its energy and genius into works of stone that would endure for centuries. This brings us to one of the most contentious and important debates in Easter Island studies, the debate between the collapse interpretation and the resilience interpretation of Rapa Nui history. The collapse interpretation, as we have discussed, presents the history of Easter Island as a cautionary tale of environmental destruction and societal collapse. In this reading, the Rapa Nui degraded their environment through overexploitation, triggered a population crash, descended into warfare and cannibalism, and were reduced to a miserable remnant by the time the Europeans arrived. The Moai in this interpretation are monuments to folly, evidence of a society that wasted its resources on vanity projects while its environment collapsed around it. The resilience interpretation, championed by researchers such as Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, presents a very different picture. In this reading, the Rapa Nui faced real environmental challenges that were partly of their own making and partly caused by factors beyond their control, such as the impact of the Polynesian rat, but they responded to those challenges with creativity, adaptability, and resilience. They developed new agricultural techniques. They shifted their subsistence strategies. They reorganized their political and religious systems. They maintained a viable society on a difficult and degraded landscape for centuries. The real catastrophe, the population collapse, the cultural destruction, the loss of knowledge, came not from indigenous environmental mismanagement but from European contact, disease, slave raiding, and colonial exploitation. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere between these two poles. Both interpretations contain important truths, and both have been supported by genuine evidence. The deforestation was real and consequential. The environmental degradation was significant. The social upheaval was genuine. But the Rapa Nui were not helpless victims of their own stupidity. They were creative, adaptive people who faced extraordinary challenges and found ways to survive. And the ultimate destruction of their society was overwhelmingly the result of external forces that they could not have predicted or prevented. The debate matters because it shapes how we understand not just Easter Island, but the broader relationship between human societies and their environments. If the collapse narrative is correct, Easter Island is a warning, a demonstration that even seemingly insignificant environmental damage, accumulated over time, can destroy a civilization. If the resilience narrative is correct, Easter Island is a testament to human adaptability, a demonstration that people can find ways to survive and even thrive in the face of environmental degradation. Both interpretations have implications for how we think about sustainability, conservation, and the future of human civilization. Let us now turn to the modern history of Rapa Nui and the ongoing story of its people and their heritage. The annexation of Easter Island by Chile in 1888 began a new chapter in the island's history, a chapter marked by colonial control, exploitation, and the gradual but determined struggle of the Rapa Nui people for recognition, rights, and self-determination. After annexation, the Chilean government leased most of the island to a Scottish Chilean sheep ranching company, Williamson Balfour, which operated the island as a sheep ranch for decades. The Rapa Nui people were confined to a small area around the village of Hangaroa, forbidden to leave without permission, and subjected to a regime that many observers have compared to apartheid. The sheep, which eventually numbered tens of thousands, grazed freely across the island, damaging archaeological sites, eroding soil, and destroying vegetation. The Rapa Nui, meanwhile, were denied access to most of their ancestral lands, unable to farm, fish, or graze their own animals on land that had been theirs for centuries. This situation persisted, with only gradual improvements, through much of the 20th century. The Rapa Nui were not granted Chilean citizenship until 1966. The sheep ranch was not fully closed until the island was designated a national park. And even after these formal changes, the Rapa Nui continued to face discrimination, marginalization, and a lack of control over their own heritage and territory. In recent decades, however, a powerful movement for Rapa Nui rights and self-determination has gained momentum. The Rapa Nui have organized politically, advocating for land rights, cultural autonomy, and greater control over the island's tourism industry and archaeological heritage. They have fought legal battles over land ownership, challenged the Chilean government's management of the national park, and asserted their right to participate meaningfully in decisions affecting their island and their culture. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the increasing involvement of Rapa Nui people in the archaeological research conducted on their island. For much of the 20th century, archaeological work on Easter Island was conducted primarily by outside researchers, European, Chilean, and others, with minimal input from the indigenous community. The Rapa Nui were often treated as laborers or informants rather than as partners or stakeholders. This has changed significantly in recent decades, as a new generation of Rapa Nui scholars, archaeologists, and cultural practitioners has emerged, trained in modern methods but grounded in traditional knowledge and deeply committed to the preservation and interpretation of their own heritage. The Mauhenua indigenous community, established in 2017, was granted the management of the Rapa Nui National Park by the Chilean government, giving the Rapa Nui people direct control over the most important archaeological sites on their island for the first time. This was a landmark achievement, and it has had significant implications for how the sites are managed, interpreted, and presented to visitors. The Rapa Nui people have also led a cultural revival that has breathed new life into traditional practices, arts, and language. The Rapa Nui language, Vananga Rapa Nui, which was in danger of extinction in the mid-20th century, is now taught in schools and spoken by a growing number of young people. Traditional arts, wood carving, stone carving, tattoo, bark cloth making, and dance have been revived and are practiced both as cultural expression and as a source of income through tourism. The annual Tapati Rapa Nui Festival, held each February, is a 2-week celebration of Rapa Nui culture that includes traditional competitions, performances, and ceremonies, drawing both islanders and visitors from around the world. The revival of Rapa Nui culture is not merely an exercise in nostalgia or tourism marketing. It is an act of survival. For a people who were reduced to barely more than 100 individuals in the late 19th century, who lost most of their cultural knowledge, their language, their sacred objects, and their connection to their ancestral practices, the revival of traditional culture is an assertion of identity, a declaration that they are still here, that they have survived, and that their culture is alive. And at the center of that cultural identity stand the Moai, the great stone ancestors, the guardians, the walkers. The Moai have become the most recognized symbol of Rapa Nui, known around the world, reproduced on posters, postcards, t-shirts, and book covers, instantly recognizable even to people who know nothing else about the island or its history. This global fame has been both a blessing and a burden for the Rapa Nui people. On one hand, it has brought attention, tourism revenue, and a sense of pride and recognition. On the other hand, it has sometimes reduced the Moai to a commodity, a visual icon stripped of its cultural and spiritual meaning, exploited for commercial purposes by people who have no connection to or understanding of the culture that created them. The Rapa Nui have responded to this challenge by asserting their ownership of their cultural heritage and demanding that the Moai be treated with the respect they deserve, not as curiosities or tourist attractions, but as sacred ancestors, embodiments of mana, and the spiritual foundation of a living culture. The conservation challenges facing the Moai are significant and growing. The statues are made of volcanic tuff, a porous and relatively soft stone that is vulnerable to weathering, erosion, and biological attack. Centuries of exposure to wind, rain, salt spray, and temperature fluctuations have taken their toll, and many Moai show significant surface deterioration, loss of detail, cracking, spalling, and the growth of lichen and other organisms on their surfaces. The buried statues at Rano, Raraku, which were protected from weathering by the surrounding soil, are now at risk as excavation exposes them to the elements for the first time in centuries. Tourism itself is a significant threat. Easter Island receives approximately 100,000 visitors per year, a number that is enormous relative to the island's small size, limited infrastructure, and fragile archaeological sites. The pressure of tourism, foot traffic, touching of statues, vibration from vehicles, and the general wear and tear of mass visitation is causing measurable damage to the Moai and the Ahu platforms. Managing this pressure while maintaining the tourism revenue that the island's economy depends on is one of the central challenges facing the Rapa Nui community and the Chilean authorities. Climate change poses an additional and growing threat. Rising sea levels and increased storm intensity threaten the coastal Ahu platforms, many of which sit at or near the current high tide line. Increased rainfall intensity could accelerate soil erosion at the Raraku Quarry, exposing more buried statues to weathering. Changes in ocean chemistry and temperature could affect the offshore islets and their seabird colonies, including the sooty terns that are the focus of the Birdman tradition. These conservation challenges are being addressed through a combination of scientific research, community engagement, and international cooperation. Conservation teams, including both Rapa Nui specialists and outside experts, are monitoring the condition of the Moai, developing treatment protocols for deteriorating surfaces, and implementing site management strategies to reduce the impact of tourism. International organizations, including UNESCO, which designated Easter Island a World Heritage Site in 1995, provide technical and financial support for conservation efforts. But the ultimate guardians of the Moai are the people who made them, the Rapa Nui themselves, and their commitment to preserving their ancestors' legacy while adapting to the challenges of the modern world is perhaps the most inspiring chapter of the Easter Island story. Let us consider, as we approach the end of this documentary, what the Moai mean not just to the Rapa Nui, not just to archaeologists and historians, but to all of us. What do these stone giants, standing on their platforms at the edge of the world, say about the human condition? They speak, first and foremost, of the power of belief. The Rapa Nui carved their moai not because they had to, not because the statues served any practical function, but because they believed. They believed in their ancestors. They believed in mana. They believed that the stone giants they carved and erected would channel spiritual power onto their land and their people, protecting them, empowering them, connecting them to the great chain of being that stretched from the founding ancestors to the living community and forward to the generations yet to come. The Moai were acts of faith, and the faith that inspired them was powerful enough to move mountains, or at least to carve them into giants and walk them across the island. They speak also of the power of community. No individual carved a Moai, no individual transported one, no individual erected one. The Moai were collective achievements, requiring the coordinated effort of dozens or hundreds of people: carvers, transporters, builders, farmers, cooks, rope makers, tool makers, all working together toward a common goal. The Moai are monuments to cooperation, to the human capacity for organized collective action in pursuit of a shared vision. They speak of ingenuity. The engineering challenges of carving, transporting, and erecting the Moai were immense, and the Rapa Nui solved them with nothing but stone, wood, rope, and the most powerful tool of all, the human mind. They did not need wheels, they did not need metal, they did not need instructions from outsiders or supernatural intervention. They figured it out themselves through observation, experimentation, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. The Moai are proof that technological sophistication is not measured by the complexity of your tools, but by the cleverness of your solutions. They speak of ambition, the decision to carve a 72-foot statue from a mountainside, knowing that it might take years, knowing that it might fail, knowing that the effort might be wasted, is an act of extraordinary ambition. It is a refusal to accept limitations, a determination to reach beyond what seems possible, a stubborn, beautiful insistence that the human spirit can achieve more than the rational mind would predict. The Moai are monuments to the audacity of human aspiration, and they speak, finally, of impermanence. The Moai were toppled. The great ancestors were pulled down from their platforms and left face down in the earth. The system that created them collapsed or transformed. The people who built them were devastated by forces beyond their control. The forest that sustained them vanished. The knowledge that gave them meaning was lost. The Moai remind us that even the greatest achievements are vulnerable to environmental change, to social upheaval, to the passage of time, to the relentless erosion of wind and rain and sea. But impermanence is not the same as futility. The Moai were toppled, but they were not destroyed. They lie where they fell, or they have been re-erected by their descendants, and they still command awe, still inspire wonder, still speak across the centuries to anyone willing to listen. The civilization that created them was transformed, but it was not extinguished. The people endure, the culture endures, the ancestors endure. On a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a people without metal, without wheels, without any contact with any other civilization on Earth, carved nearly 1,000 giant stone statues, moved them miles across the landscape, and erected them on massive platforms where they stood for centuries, gazing inland, watching over the land, channeling the mana of the ancestors onto the people they protected. The statues walked. That fact, that simple, astonishing, undeniable fact, is one of the most remarkable things that human beings have ever accomplished. Not because of the size of the statues, or the distance they traveled, or the ingenuity of the methods used to move them, although all of these are remarkable, but because of what it says about us, about all of us, about the human capacity for vision, for determination, for faith, and for the sheer, stubborn refusal to believe that anything is impossible. The Rapa Nui looked at a mountain and saw giants waiting to be born. They looked at a 13-ton block of stone and saw it walking. They looked at a tiny, isolated, wind-battered speck of land in the middle of an infinite ocean and saw the navel of the world, the center of everything, the place where all of existence began and ended, and they made it so. They carved the giants from the mountain. They walked them across the island. They raised them on their platforms and opened their eyes and set them to watch forever over the land. And even now, centuries after the last Moai was carved, centuries after the last one was toppled, centuries after the old world of the Erection and the ancestral spirits gave way to the new world of the Birdman, and then to the new world of Christianity and colonial rule and modernity, even now the Moai stand. Some of them were re-erected by their descendants who wanted their ancestors to stand again. Some of them still lie where they fell in the grass, their great faces pressed against the earth. Some of them remain in the quarry at Rano, Raraku, half-carved, half-born, still emerging from the mountain, waiting for the carvers who will never return. They are all still there, on that tiny island, at the edge of the world, and they are watching. There is a final question that we have not yet addressed, and it is perhaps the most profound question of all. It is not a question about engineering or logistics or ecology or politics. It is a question about meaning. Why did they face inland? We have discussed the practical answer. The Moai faced inland because they were projecting ancestral mana over their clan's territory and people. They were guardians, watchers, protectors. They faced the land because the land was what they were protecting. But there is something deeper in that choice, something that resonates beyond the specific cultural context of Rapa Nui. The Moai do not face the sea. They do not face the horizon. They do not face the unknown, the unexplored, the great beyond. They face home. They face the known. They face the people. In a world of infinite ocean, where the horizon is empty in every direction, where the next inhabited land is thousands of miles away, the Moai turn their backs on all of that vastness and look inward. They look at the villages, the gardens, the children playing, the elders sitting in the shade, the fires burning in the hearths. They look at life, at the daily, ordinary, precious life of the community. This is not a turning away from the world. It is a turning toward what matters most. The Moai say, "We are here, we are watching, we are your ancestors, and we have not forgotten you. We stand between you and the void. We face you, not because the ocean behind us is unimportant, but because you are more important. You the living, you the inheritors of our mana. You the reason we were carved, the reason we walked, the reason we stand." That is what the stone faces say in their silence, in their stillness, in their ancient, patient, unblinking gaze. We are watching, we are here, we are yours. Let us close with a moment, not a fact, not an argument, not a theory, but a moment. A moment that any visitor to Easter Island can experience, and that once experienced is never forgotten. Go to Tongariki at dawn. Stand in the plaza in front of the 15 Moai in the cool, salt-scented darkness before sunrise. Wait. The sky to the east begins to lighten. The stars fade. The first gray light touches the outlines of the statues, and they begin to emerge from the darkness, 15 enormous shapes, shoulder to shoulder, looming against the brightening sky. For a few minutes they are silhouettes, featureless, monolithic, immense, black shapes against a sky that is shifting from gray to pink to gold. And then the sun rises. The first ray of light comes over the horizon, over the Pacific, over the edge of the world, and it strikes the backs of the Moai. Their shadows stretch toward you, long and dark, reaching across the plaza like the fingers of giants. The light moves up the statues, touching their shoulders, their necks, the backs of their great stone heads. And then it spills over the top and catches the faces, those enormous, ancient, impassive faces, and they glow. They catch the first light of the day, the light that has traveled 93 million miles across space to touch this tiny island, this row of stone figures, this moment. You are standing in the shadow of the ancestors. The sun is on their faces. They are looking at you, not through you, not past you, not around you. At you. Their eyes are empty. The coral is long gone, but their gaze is not empty. It is full. Full of centuries, full of mana, full of the accumulated weight of a civilization's faith, labor, genius, and love. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of the Moai as the sun rises over the Pacific, you understand something. You understand that these are not dead stones, they are not relics, they are not museum pieces or tourist attractions or data points in an archaeological study. They are ancestors. They are the embodiment of a people's belief in something greater than themselves. They are the physical expression of a love so powerful that it moved mountains, literally, and carved giants from the stone and walked them across the island and raised them up to watch over the land forever. You understand in that moment that you are in the presence of something sacred, and you understand finally why the Rapa Nui say that the statues walked, because they did. They walked out of the mountain and across the island and into eternity. They are still walking. They walk through our imagination, through our wonder, through our ceaseless human hunger to understand who we are and what we are capable of and why we are here. The giants walked, they walk still. And on a tiny island at the edge of the world, at the navel of existence, at the center of everything and nowhere at all, they stand. 15 at Tongariki, 7 at Akivi, scattered and solitary and broken and restored all around the coast of an island that is itself barely a speck on the vast blue surface of the Pacific. They stand and they watch and they wait. They have been waiting for a very long time. They will wait a while longer. The Rapa Nui carved nearly 1,000 moai. They moved them across miles of rough terrain. They raised them on platforms and opened their eyes and set them to guard the living on behalf of the dead. They did this without metal, without wheels, without writing, without any help from the outside world. They did it with stone and wood and rope and faith, and then their world changed. The trees fell, the birds vanished, the old gods faded. New gods arrived in canoes and sailing ships in the relentless, devastating tide of a wider world that the Rapa Nui had never known existed. Diseases came, slavers came, missionaries came, governments came. And through all of it, through the toppling of the Moai, through the devastation of disease, through the humiliation of colonialism, through the loss of language and knowledge and identity, through all of it, the Rapa Nui survived. They are still here on their island with their ancestors. The Moai were toppled and they were raised again. The language was nearly lost and it was revived. The dances were forgotten and they were remembered. The stories were scattered and they were gathered. The people were reduced to 111 souls, and they grew again. The Rapa Nui are one of the great survivor stories in human history, and the Moai, those magnificent, impossible, heartbreaking, awe-inspiring stone giants, are the symbols of that survival. They were built by a people at the height of their creative power. They were toppled in a time of crisis and transformation, and they were raised again by a people who refused to let their ancestors fall. That is the story of Easter Island. That is the story of the Moai. That is the story of a people who looked at a mountain and saw giants and who made those giants walk. It is a story about stone. It is a story about faith. It is a story about ingenuity and ambition and competition and cooperation and environmental change and social transformation and colonial destruction and cultural survival. But most of all, it is a story about people, real people, brilliant, flawed, determined, creative, resilient people. People who lived on a tiny island at the edge of the world and who, with nothing but their own strength and their own minds and their own unshakable belief in their ancestors, created one of the most extraordinary monuments in the history of human civilization. They carved the giants from the mountain. The giants walked, and on a tiny island in the Pacific, under a sky of infinite blue, the ancestors still stand, still watching, still guarding, still waiting, for as long as the stone endures. For as long as the people remember, for as long as anyone anywhere looks at those great stone faces and feels deep in their bones the tremor of wonder, the Moai of Rapa Nui, nearly 1,000 giants carved from a mountain, walked across an island, raised to watch over a world, they are still watching, and they always will be.